Number 5. Randy Greenawalt and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The 2 men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert, where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers and Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades on death row. Number 4. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lyda Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lyda married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lyda was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lyda a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meyer, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lyda. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lyda was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bed sheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief.
At number 3, D.B. Cooper. In 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man claiming to be Dan Cooper boarded Flight 305 in Portland bound for Seattle. While in the air, he opened his briefcase and showed a bomb to a flight attendant, then he proceeded to hijack the plane. The plane then landed in Seattle. Once on the ground, he demanded $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and food. Once he got what he requested, he released the passengers, and he, along with the pilots and flight attendant, took off from Seattle with the marked bills. About 45 minutes after takeoff, they were over Portland, and Cooper jumped into the night. Then 9 years later, in 1980, just north of Portland, by the Columbian River, a young boy was digging a fire pit and uncovered 3 bundles of cash. These bills matched the marked serial numbers of the bills that were given to Cooper. That was the last bit of evidence to ever be found about this case, and still to this day, no one knows his true identity or what happened to him. This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in FBI history. And nothing has been said for years, but just a few months ago, back in January of this year, a startling claim was made to the media that D.B. Cooper was actually a former CIA operative named Robert Rackshaw. Robert just so happens to be alive and well living in California, but he has yet to be charged with anything. Coming in at number 2, SS Ourang-Medan. This is one of the most frightening and mind-boggling death at sea stories out there. In June of 1947, multiple ships were traveling in Strait of Malacca. All of them received a terrifying SOS message from the Dutch ship, the SS Ourang-Medan, that read all of the passengers, including the officer, were dead. Possible whole crew dead. The nearest merchant ship, called the Silver Star, traveled to the ship as fast as they could. But upon boarding the Ourang-Medan, they were horrified as they realized that every crew member was in fact dead. Their corpses were scattered all over the deck. It was especially haunting as all of the corpses' eyes were open and they had complete looks of terror on their faces. The radio operator was found dead as well, with his fingers still on the Morse sending key. So yes, he died as he was trying to send out this distress signal. What's even stranger is that there were no attack marks found on any of the crew members. The other ship was then going to tow the SS Ourang-Medan back to shore, but before they could, smoke began to come up from the deck below, the ship exploded and sank. To this day, the exact fate of the ship's crew remains a mystery. But of course, there have been many theories such as ghosts, hazardous chemicals, and even aliens. But there's still no conclusion as to what actually happened. And at number 1, Jack the Ripper. This name may sound familiar as it has been in many TV shows and movies. This was a man who killed 11 women in London's East End in the late 1800s. The creepiest part about this is that he was never identified. Most of the women he went after were prostitutes. He would mutilate their bodies so badly that they were unrecognizable, and he would slash their throats. This killer would actually then remove organs from these women after he killed them, and it's expected he kept them as trophies. When the murders were taking place, the townspeople were always in constant fear, and a lot of suspicion was going around. The police were forming committees, and the townspeople were forming mobs and attacked people they believed to be the killer. And then after the 11th murder, the killings just all of a sudden stopped. An investigation to find the killer continued on for 3 years, but the police were never able to uncover the identity of Jack the Ripper. The case was officially closed in 1892. However, the interest in the killings never lessened. I mean, after all, we are still talking about it to this day, aren't we?
Number 5. Grigory Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, was a mystical healer who wandered Russia in the early 20th century. Now, I could do a plot summary of what Rasputin got up to, but honestly, Boney M did a better job than I ever will, so just I'll tab out of this video real quick, listen to that song, come on back. Okay. Did you? Well, if you didn't, the quick rundown is that the black monk genuinely believed himself to be a holy healer with otherworldly powers, and was appointed a lofty position by Tsarina Alexandra to heal the young prince of his hemophilia. He was rumored to be part of a secret order called Klisti, connected with all sorts of scandalous practices. Now, no official connection was ever made to Rasputin and the sect. Rumors of the man still persisted. He carried an infamous reputation around the country, with stories of his wild debauchery and black magic, stories of wild powers. Did he really have otherworldly powers? Given his infamous nigh immortality, I am a bit inclined to agree with him. The man simply could not be put down without serious effort. There was a plot to have him enticed by a courtesan and castrated until he caught wind of it. In 1914, he was in the chest by a beggar and shrugged it off like it was nothing. Now, of course, the most famous story of Rasputin was his assassination at the hands of the Tsar's cousin and a handful of noblemen. As the famous legend goes, he was poisoned, bludgeoned, and drowned, and still that wasn't enough until he passed later in the day. Was Rasputin just Russia's toughest customer, built different? Or did he have some sort of mystical help from another world? We may never know. And are we having fun with the channel, my little freaks and creeps? Stay subscribed for more scary content every single day. Number 4. Vlad the Impaler. You know, with a title like Vlad the Impaler, it's safe to assume that the guy was probably up to no good, demon or no demon. Perhaps you've heard the legend that Vlad Tepes was the inspiration for Count Dracula, which should tell you even more if you want to judge of this guy's moral character. Vlad was a prince of Wallachia, an area that's now known as modern Romania. Vlad grew up in a very dark period of Wallachian history, coming up while the Ottoman Empire was setting its sights on just about everything good in Eastern Europe. Vlad was made king of Wallachia, but first he was deposed and exiled exiled after an assassination plot on his brother and father. He would reclaim the throne in 1458 and quickly began a campaign of bloodlust to show the world he was not someone you should be messing with. One of his most infamous acts, and where the dubious title comes from, was after fending off an Ottoman invasion, he impaled 20,000 soldiers and left them as a grim forest of the damned. And some legends say he would eat dinner in front of this. Downright demonic behavior. There's some debate as to whether or not he really is the inspiration for Dracula, although of note is that beside his infamous sobriquet Vlad the Impaler, he went by the nickname Vlad Dracul, owning from his father's position in the Order of the Dragon, which translated to Dracul. There are also stories of Vlad washing his hands with the blood of his enemies, which I'm gonna be honest, that kind of sounds like something Dracula would do. It's worth noting too, no one really knows what happened to Vlad's body. We know that he was slain in battle, and that he was eventually put down after years of carnage, but his body or grave has never been found. Perhaps it's because it's still walking, or flapping. Whatever a bat does.
In third place, we have Barbarian. Probably the most recent release on today's list, and rated R. Barbarian came out in 2022 and was picked up by HBO Max, and later got bounced to Disney Plus when it was deemed too scary for the original platform. Netflix never wanted it, adamant it was too scary for their viewers. Documentary researcher Tess has booked an Airbnb and arrives at night in the pouring rain to find a guy named Keith is already staying there. So Keith is played by well-known spooky actor Bill Skarsgård, and if that doesn't ring a bell, he's the current Pennywise the Clown. Ergo, he's dang good at being creepy. He eventually convinces her to stay until they can get this sorted, and since she can see proof of reservation, she decides why not. And being a gentleman, the guy offers to take the couch. As is with many things I watch, my common sense is already screaming, but a trope is a trope. When Tess wakes up in the middle of the night, she's kinda shaken up to find her bedroom door has been opened, but Keith is asleep and assures her he did not touch the door. The next morning she goes for her interview and is warned not to stay in the area where she is staying. Upon returning to the house, she is chased inside by a homeless man who yells at her to leave, and winds up locked in the basement, stumbling across a hidden corridor, leading to a room with a camcorder, a stained mattress, and a red handprint. Keith eventually tries to save her, but the pair are attacked by a naked, deformed woman, referred to later as the mother, who kills them. Later on, Airbnb owner AJ is introduced, zipping down some coastal road in a convertible, only to find out in a phone call that he's being accused of doing something horrible to an actress. As someone who very likely did said thing, AJ is more concerned with his career and putting this behind him. So he's been pressured to sell his assets to pay his legal costs, so he travels to Detroit to inspect the house before selling it, and finds the hidden tunnel and tries to measure it, believing it may increase the house's value. So the mother attacks AJ in the tunnel, and he falls into a hole where he meets Tess. A flashback to the 1980s shows Frank, the house's original owner, abducting women, sexually taking advantage of them, and keeping them captive in the tunnels. In the present, the mother locks Tess and AJ in the hole. Tess tells AJ that the mother wants them to act as her children. AJ is then dragged away by the mother, who forcibly breastfeeds him, and Tess uses the opportunity to get the heck out of Dodge. While the summary might not sound super scary and rather cheesy and tropey, it's the use of cinematography and framing that really sets the tone for nightmares for those brave enough to watch. Gore scenes include a head being bashed against a wall until it's a red pulp, eye gouging, which an arm being ripped off and used as a club, a red kaboom wound, and more. If that isn't enough, there's discussion and dialogue about sexual aggression towards women, as well as dialogue about inbreeding. I'm torn between wanting to watch this tonight before bed or waiting for a day off, but let me know what y'all think in the comments. In second place, we have Shrew's Nest. So this is a horror film that was released in 2014 and was deemed too scary for any streaming service until Shudder came to be in 2016, and has been highly praised as one of the original films of the platform. Plot is set in the 1950s in an apartment in Madrid. Agoraphobic main character Montse earns her living by working as a seamstress out of her home, and lost her youth taking care of her younger sister, who's referred to as the girl, who brings, some additional earnings to the household by working at a store outside of the home. Montse is at odds with the prospect of her sister establishing intimate relationships with males, despite the girl actually coming of age. Our main character chooses to hide from reality, feeding an obsessive, unhinged temperament, and experiences visions of her awful father who abandoned the family, mocking her. Carlos, a neighbor of the ladies, falls down the stairs and looks for help knocking on the apartment's door, and Montse, despite, reluctance, eventually proceeds to drag an unconscious and injured Carlos in. She becomes infatuated with him, who, being wounded in the leg, is unable to move out of the bed. During secret meetings of the girl and Carlos, the former advises Carlos to get the heck out of there, and to no success, as Carlos left the altar on his wedding night and is on the run from commitment from his pregnant fiancée, because he doesn't want to deal with the responsibilities as a husband and a father. So, Gold star for him. Monty drugs him with morphine, and when he does attempt to escape, she sews his leg to the bed. After killing his fiancée and others, Monty meets her demise at the hands of the girl, who's trying to help Carlos escape. In Monty's last words, the girl finds out that she is actually Monty's daughter, as her grief-stricken father impregnated Monty after the death of Monty's mother. Instead of the dad running away, Monty poisoned him to put an end to his awful behavior on Monty herself and her innocent daughter, keeping her father's body on her bed for weeks before storing his remains in the armoire, and was too ashamed to tell her the truth. I promise not to spoil the actual ending, but it's a doozy. In first place, we have Night of the Living Dead. Yep, the first big modern zombie film. Released in 1968, it was directed, photographed, and edited by George A. Romero, written by Romero and John Russo, and produced by Russell Streiner and Carl Hardman. A crazy group of individuals takes refuge in an abandoned house when corpses begin to leave the graveyard in search of fresh human bodies to devour. Main character Ben does his best to control the situation, but when the reanimated bodies surround the house, the other survivors begin to panic. Any semblance of order within the group begins to dissipate. The zombies start to find ways inside, and one by one, the living humans become the prey of the deceased ones. If you haven't watched it before today, shame on you, because it's a masterpiece and a half. It premiered in Pittsburgh on October 1st of 1968, and it grossed 12 million American dollars domestically and 18 million internationally, earning more than 250 times its budget and making it one of the most profitable film productions ever made at the time. So it was released shortly before the adoption of the Motion Picture Association of America rating system, and the film's explicit violence and gore was considered groundbreaking, leading to a lot of controversy and negative reviews. Its first showing was a weekend matinee, and some folks brought their little ones to it. As someone who scares people for a living and questions when adults bring strollers to a haunted event, this was many times worse, fully traumatizing some of the little ones. Zombies are shown in this eating the organs and entrails of the victims they've killed. A young woman turns into a zombie and impales her mother to death repeatedly with a trowel. Zombies are killed with rifle targets to the head, set on fire, and crushed with tire irons. Humans are trying to survive, but they turn on each other, including one scene in which one man kills another with a kaboom device. It eventually garnered a cult following and critical acclaim, and has appeared on lists of the greatest and most influential films by outlets such as Empire, the New York Times, and Total Film. In 1999, the film was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry. In February 2020, Netflix took down Night of the Living Dead from its streaming service in Germany following a legal request because the film is banned in that country. And that brings us to the end of our time, and I'm feeling the need for a Terrence Dunick triple feature tonight. Who needs sleep when that's an option?
Starting off this countdown, we have Gilles Garnet. Now, not only was this guy a witch, but he actually used his witchy powers to conjure up a potion that would transform him into a werewolf whenever he so pleased. That's right, he was a witch and a werewolf. In October of 1572 France, that's when Garnier killed his first victim as a werewolf. He grabbed the poor girl and dragged her into a vineyard. He then proceeded to tear the flesh off of her bones with his teeth and eat it. But he was still not satisfied after, so he went and ate another victim. He struck again the following month. He took on his werewolf form and attacked a man and ate his stomach. This kept going on and on until someone caught him. Well, actually, they didn't really know it was him at first, but they claimed that they saw some weird man-like beast crouching over and eating one of the victims. That's when the authorities were like, oh shit, there's a werewolf on the loose, and then they were out looking for this weird werewolf man. While they were out looking for him, people kept going missing like crazy, and eventually he was caught. One evening, a group of workers were traveling across towns when they spotted the werewolf man. As they got closer, they saw it was Garnier and obviously reported his ass to the authorities. At trial, he confessed to having stalked and murdered at least 4 individuals, but the number was indeed higher. In the end, he was found guilty of witchcraft and lycanthropy, and he was burned at the stake. Moving on to number 4, we have Lasses Birgitta. Lasses Birgitta was an alleged Swedish witch back in the 1500s. In fact, she was the first woman executed for witchcraft in Sweden. Story goes that one night her and 2 men met up at a churchyard cemetery with plans to resurrect people from the dead using their witchy powers. When they arrived at the church, Lasses used her powers to open the church doors. This involved her circling the place 3 times and then blowing into the keyhole. Magically it opened for them and they entered. While in the church, they were looking for a stole. You know, the scarf type pieces of cloth that are worn by priests? That was needed in order to complete the ritual. After finally finding it, she renounced God and swore herself to the devil. Somehow, people found out that the 3 had attempted to resurrect the dead and reported them. Lasses was decapitated for being a witch, whereas the other 2 men were just fined. That's rough, man. That's rough. I'm also glad that their plan to bring back the dead didn't work. Like, imagine they would have to fight off witches and then zombies. Crazy.
Number 3. Herbert Mullen. 1970s again. At the exact same time, in the same area, police had two serial killers to keep up with: Herbert Mullen and Edmund Kemper. No relationship to each other or each other's cases. Mullen was a paranoid schizophrenic in and out of mental health facilities in California during his teens. Mullen then kills 14 people during a 4-month period due to, quote, the impending natural disaster that would happen if he didn't. Mullen was convinced that the voice in his head he was hearing was telepathic. Mullen claims the voice of the Father had explained that the Vietnam War acted as a giant sacrifice that saved us from an earthquake and another one was coming soon. Constantly hearing the man's voice named the Father, encouraging him to gain more blood sacrifices, Mullen bludgeoned a man to death with a baseball bat. Mullen claims that the man was actually Jonah from the Bible and was begging him to sacrifice himself to Mullen. He then murdered a woman in the front seat of his car before dismembering her in a nearby park. Yeah, this is real satanic stuff, I told you. His third victim, a priest that he was confessing to in a Catholic church. Mullen says the priest claims to have telepathically begged him to sacrifice his life for the cause. Mullen then killed 5 people in one day. He claims that all the victims telepathically begged to be sacrificed as a good deed to the Father. Herbert Mullen remains in custody, and who was the father who kept talking to him through all of these people? Number 2, Richard Ramirez. This next guy is really nasty and deserves to be in the second spot. 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. Sounds like a hell of a guy. The Night Stalker. Charming name for what this man did. Born in Texas, his older brother went to Vietnam and returned with some pretty gruesome stories and some pretty gruesome visuals. The young Ramirez, soaking all of this up, grows up obsessed with the satanic occult and fascinated. He made various references to Satan during his legal proceedings. His trial began in 1989 and he was convicted of 13 murders and a variety of other crimes. Nearly 2 months later, he was sentenced to death, with the judge stating that his crimes showed, quote, cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. And the worst part was that he made most of his victims pray to Satan and swear on Satan that they were going to tell him the truth whatever he asked. I'm not really going to get into the sick details of really what this man did, nor will I with the number 1 spot, but it involved hammers, machetes, ropes, knives, guns, you name it, anything violent. He was an absolute nasty creature that liked to torture his victims and really drive the satanic love for you-know-who. First responders would have taken pictures of numerous satanic symbols drawn on the walls in almost a ritualistic reenactment. He was captured by the use of the huge media surrounding his story on the way to take his next victim's life. His trial was truly a disgusting display of media attention, one of the most expensive court cases to date, losing only to O.J. Simpson. He screamed "Hail Satan" at his hearing and flashed self-harm pentagrams. He died of cancer in 2013. This guy must have signed some sort of book for you-know-who. Coming in at number 1, Charles Manson. Okay, so most of us are all familiar with this man and his famous case amongst American pop culture. Ramirez was said to have been a copycat of this man, and I can see why with all the satanicness. California in the late 1960s. A criminal, musician, and a victim of LSD studies, Charles Manson would go on to start and lead the Manson family cult. A small religious group with unclear motives but lost souls and a ton of drugs and a father to now a family. In summer 1969, some of the cult members committed murders in LA. Apparently Manson had ordered his followers to kill the people who had lived at the address he had given them for their initiation. The murder of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in her home on August 8th and 9th, including the La Biancas the next day. Another 2 victims. 4 members of the family committed the murders under Manson's instructions and satanic offering. Manson apparently heard voices that there was going to be a race war brought on by religious disputes, and that these killings were an offering to who exactly? The famous helter-skelter message, incoherent scribbles, blood all over the walls. They were then to hide underground in, quote, the bottomless pit under Death Valley, which Manson knew the location of, but instead were caught on the run days later. Manson was sentenced to life in prison under the pretense that he was the one who targeted, planned, and brainwashed his, quote, piggies into committing. While in prison, Charles was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoid delusion disorder, seeing visions and hearing voices for more than half of his life. He died in prison in 2017. Yeah, I've seen what Tarantino did with his latest movie, and it's definitely a subtle PG-13 fiction version of what actually went down on that night. What do you guys think? Do you think Charles saw the devil? I think he actually was the devil.
Coming in our number 5 spot, the Devil's Footprints. On February 8th in 1855, a mysterious footprint shaped as a hoof appeared overnight after a heavy snowfall in southern Devon. According to reports, these footprints stretched over 100 miles. They also somehow went through solid walls and haystacks, appearing on the other side as if there was no barrier. The footprints were always 8.5 inches apart and had 1 foot going in front of the other. This suggested that it was from a creature that was bipedal rather than a creature that walked on all fours. Some suggest that these footprints belonged to the devil who was roaming the countryside looking for sinners. In at number 4, the Bouvet Islands. Deep in the South Atlantic, the Bouvet Island has been described as one of the most isolated places on Earth. The nearest landmass to it is Antarctica, which is more than 1,700 kilometers south. No one has ever inhabited this island, and since plant life is unsustainable, it's unlikely anyone ever will. Yet in 1964, when a British expedition arrived from South Africa, they actually discovered an abandoned lifeboat in a lagoon on the island. Close by the boat, they found oars, wood, a drum, and a copper tank. But the strange part, there was absolutely no trace of any passengers. The boat had no identifiable marks, and therefore it couldn't be tracked back to any nation or shipping company, which was a requirement for boats or lifeboats back in the day. What's even more strange is that 2 years later, another expedition was sent to the island, and the lifeboat and all of the objects around it were gone. To this day, no one knows how the boat got there or what happened to the people who were on it or who they were.
Number 3. Nikolai Zhumagaliev, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year, whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later, and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he'd invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him, but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least 1 more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities, for decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had, based on witness statements, to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their number 1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini, and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian, looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them. Not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to begin calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force, who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old, after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.
In 5th place, we have The Wailing. Rated 18A, it's a 2016 South Korean horror film written and directed by Na Hong-jin and starring Kwak Do-won, Hwang Jun-min, Chun Woo-hee. In the movie, a series of gore-drenched slangs hits home for Jung-gu, a slow-witted cop in a small town, when he discovers that his daughter, Hyo-jin, has become afflicted by, well, whatever is killing his fellow townsfolk. So he is, as the first hour or so suggests, completely out of his depth. And at one point in the film, writer and director minds his story back for, dark humor, and wins viewers over by making our main character look like a lovable screw-up. He's confronted with a mountain of bodies, an evil foreigner with a cabin full of creepy photos, and plague-like omens that manifest in the form of dead ravens, a rock-churning mute, and crazy dreams. The Wailing received widespread critical acclaim. On popular review website Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 99% and an average rating of 8 out of 10, based on 82 reviews. The site's critics' consensus reads, "The Wailing delivers an atmospheric, cleverly constructed mystery whose supernatural thrills more than justify its imposing length." On fellow website Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 81 out of 100 based on 19 critics, indicating, universal acclaim. It was released in South Korea on May 12th of 2016. The film was shown in the out of competition section at the Cannes Film Festival in France on May 18th and was released in the United States on May 27th. It was then released on Netflix at a later date, but it has since been taken off the streaming service. Well, if you'll excuse me, this sounds like something I should perhaps watch, maybe even tonight. In 4th place, we have Repo the Genetic Opera. Call me biased all you want. This beloved train wreck and its sequels are some of my favorite comfort media watches. Where the heck else am I going to see an ensemble like Paul Sorvino, Paris Hilton, Anthony Head, Sarah Brightman, Ogre, Alexa Penavega, and Terrence Dunnock all in the same place? It's like a Tumblr fanfic mess come to life. Oh, and if you didn't gather from the title, it's an actual genuine opera, so it's entirely sung. The movie takes place in the mid-21st century, when an epidemic of organ failures leads to the rise of GeneCo, a company providing transplants at a great price. And by mid-21st century, I mean 2056 to be exact, so a little over 30 years from now. Those who miss their payments become targets of GeneCo mercenaries, who repossess the organs. The CEO of GeneCo, Roddy Largo, discovers he is terminally ill and is adamant that his offspring aren't worthy heirs to his fortune, and instead plans to give his entire fortune to 17-year-old Shiloh Wallace, the daughter of his late ex-fiancée, Marnie. In this crazy world of addiction and legalized killing, Shiloh is a sheltered girl who seeks a cure for her rare disease as well as information about her family's mysterious history. She meets a whole wild crew of folks along the way and learns a lot about her dad. Spoiler alert, it turns out he's been making her sick the entire time to try and protect/cure her, out of guilt from losing his wife. Granted, I didn't super expect a doctor by day who masquerades as a repo killer slasher man by night to be, super ethical. I'm willing to bet though, most of y'all have heard at least one song from this. Does Zydrate come in a little glass vial? Sound familiar? Zydrate is the substance that sedates folks for their surgery in this world, and it's super hecking pricey, ergo why most folks buy it secondhand off of dealers. This movie really likes its gore, and since it shares a director with the first 4 Saw films, you can probably get an idea of what to expect visually. Usually I'm not one for gore, preferring psychological horror, but something about this film just scratched a really happy itch in my brain the first time I saw it, and it has become a favorite ever since. When the film was originally being promoted, due to a lack of studio support, the director, Darren Bousman, and creator/grave robber, Terrence Dunnick, did most of their own promotion by hosting a Repo Road Tour. The tour was set up for one-night screenings in 7 different United States cities and included extensive question and answer sessions following each showing. Because of strong ticket sales, a second and third touring session were added, in addition to a British tour across 4 locations. The film received a limited release in the United States and Canada on November 7th of 2008 and was released in early 2009 on DVD and Blu-ray, featuring 2 audio commentaries, 2 featurettes, the theatrical trailer, and 4 deleted scenes. As much as I'll wax poetic about it, it's not for the faint of heart. The gore alone, never mind watching Paris Hilton's face fall off, can definitely leave an impact. If you do make it through Repo, I highly recommend also giving The Devil's Carnival and its sequel a watch. While they're not direct sequels to Repo, they have the same grit, and the dark circus and religion themes are fabulous. Also, you get the additions of David Hasselhoff and Adam Pascal, which makes it a win in my book.
Number 3. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of history's most infamous criminals, and honestly, maybe the most. Over 130 years ago, and we are still absolutely fascinated by his crimes, and we still don't even know for certain who he was. Could still be out there, he could still be at large. He terrorized Whitechapel through the year of 1888, leaving behind a series of sickeningly grisly crime scenes, torn apart and left in the street for all to see. There are at least 5 confirmed cases that are attributed to Jack the Ripper, but there are several more that are speculated to be attached to him, with some suggesting that it could be anywhere from 13 or higher. Jack eluded capture, stupefied his pursuers, and taunted his would-be captors, sending the police souvenirs, I guess, from his crimes, wrapping in the mail and sending them out. On one occasion, he did this alongside a threatening letter, boldly claiming to be from hell. Known as the From Hell letter, the jeering letter taunted the police, inviting them to catch him, while he described the pleasure he took in his sick, sordid dealings. Investigators were downright stumped trying to find the guy. They suspected he didn't have any level of medical training, as his hurried slashes led them to believe he could have been a butcher. The way he slashed his victims was beyond horrific. He left them missing and in some cases beyond recognition. It seemed too like he could be in multiple places at once. A body discovered in New York a few years after the crime spree matched the victims of Whitechapel almost perfectly. Was it a human performing all these sickening acts? Or could the Ripper's mangling be attributed to a demon that was preying on the women of White Castle? It would explain how he was so elusive and managed to evade capture for all those years. Number 2. Emperor Nero. Now perhaps you've heard of Emperor Nero. You've probably heard the story of him playing the fiddle as Rome burned around him. But honestly, historically, that barely even cracks the top 5 craziest things Nero ever accomplished in his tenure as emperor. Nero set a new standard for wildness as a world leader that I think has never been matched again. Where do I begin with him? Let's start off small. He had a dedicated legion of soldiers, referred to as the Augustans, whose sole function was to follow him around and clap and hype him up whenever he would perform. Now that's kind of harmlessly crazy. So what about the story that Nero used to use his enemies as torches for his gardens? Yeah, Nero had a passionate hatred for Christians, blaming them for the infamous fire that engulfed Rome, which some historians believe Nero himself started. That's pretty wild. But what about the fact that Nero would dress himself in the skins of animals with his romantic partners? Or about how he orchestrated the deaths of his mother and brother? Nero ensured his own position as emperor of Rome. Emperor Claudius married Nero's mother Agrippina, who then adopted Nero as his own son. When Agrippina poisoned Claudius, Nero took the throne, and then to ensure that he could keep that position on that lofty chair, he poisoned his stepbrother and would later poison his own mother to make sure no one could challenge him as emperor. He then enjoyed all the pleasures of Rome as much as he could. He depleted the treasury of Rome at one point solely to make a statue of himself in his own honor, the Colossus of Nero, to leave a lasting legacy. In the end, after years of insanity, Nero took his own life by ordering one of his own servants to stab him after being told he would be executed by the state as he was considered an enemy of Rome. He bemoaned what an artist the world was losing. Nero's proclivity for wild debauchery, outrageous pursuits of pleasure, intense wanton cruelty, and violence towards Christians led some people at the time to view Nero as the Antichrist himself. And to be honest, I get it. Number 1. Manson. Charles Manson. The most infamous cult leader in history. And he might very well be one of the most famous criminals of all time. Charles Manson had a hypnotic level of control over his devout followers, leading them to a dark crime spree that would claim the lives of 35 people. Now, Manson himself never raised a blade to anyone that we know of, but rather used his domineering charisma to orchestrate the slayings down to the littlest details. He had a grim vision of an apocalypse where he believed there was going to be a race war and that his family needed to prepare for this. And part of these preparations was bumping off key celebrities he had a list of. Manson had dominion over his followers, giving them sacrament every day when in reality he was just giving them illegal substances to keep them impressionable. He banned glasses, calendars, watches, clocks, and anything that would ground them to the real world and made them more malleable to his will. Now, Manson and his family are host to a number of conspiracy theories. There's a very popular one saying that Manson himself is a product of the CIA's MK Ultra brainwashing program, and this is why he was so effective at controlling other people, and that the whole Manson family cult was a CIA op to destabilize the hippie movement. But another very prevailing theory is that the Manson family were Satanists, and they were part of a nationwide cabal connected with other dark crimes around the same time, like the Son of Sam. Manson's obsession with evil, his dark dealings, and complete control over his subjects do make him seem a bit like a modern-day Lucifer. Could Manson have had a supernatural level of control over people?
Coming in at number 5, Michael Taylor. It's 1974, Yorkshire, England. Michael Taylor, age 31, father of 5 and husband to Christine Taylor. Michael was a well-mannered and caring father and husband. Michael, like anyone, became depressed from a back injury, left him short on work and seeming a little odd and off. After seeking religious advice and a one-on-one session at a local church, Michael started having outbursts and acting aggressively. Puzzled, he sought one-on-one sessions which turned ugly. After apparently changing form and attacking Marie, a young religious leader helping Taylor and unable to remember anything, Michael and the church agreed that an exorcism was necessary. Father Peter Vincent and Reverend Raymond Smith met at St. Thomas and started. It got so violent, he was tied to the church floor. After hours in the middle of the night, the two had managed to exorcise more than 40 demons out of Michael, in which appeared around them as they exited. Violence continued, leaving only 3 demons remaining for the next day. After returning home from the first session, Michael was found now only hours later, naked, in the middle of the street, covered head to toe in blood. Michael had returned home, to which then his wife and family dog lay dead as the police arrived in the AM. His wife, missing her eyes, tongue, and skin from the front of her skull. The dog, torn limb from limb and spread around the home. He was arrested soon after for the death of his wife. Michael had this to say about his late wife in court, quote, "I am released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed." Yeah, that was definitely a vessel for him. He was acquitted on psychological conditions, and jury found that he met his breaking point during the exorcism that night. He was acquitted on insanity and remained in and out of facilities until he passed in 2013. Number 4, David Berkowitz. New York, 1976, and the police were busy on the search for a man shooting couples in the New York area, which had started to become a citywide phenomenon that summer. Brunette women with long hair frantically cut and dyed their hair blonde in fear. The .44 caliber killer was the title the press gave David in his earliest of assaults. After losing his job, David began to experience psychotic episodes and claimed that his neighbor's German shepherd had begun talking to him and eventually explained to David that he was a demon. He took the name after the pet's owner, Sam. It was this dog who ordered the killings by David and claims that the pet coaxed David into killing. David used this summer to shoot 8 people, resulting in 6 lives and the stabbings of 2 others. Using his .44 caliber bulldog revolver revolver, David sent police on a wild goose chase around New York City with handwritten letters, David mocking the detectives with cryptic messages. Some of them explain who Sam is, and some of them explain what Sam does. Some mock police, saying that they are never going to find or stop him. David was finally arrested just hours before his next planned victim's visit. He applauded police in their ability to stop him, in the back seat of the car, laughing and cheering. Although David pleaded not guilty to insanity and pleaded guilty, expressing that he was coaxed by the demon and that it demanded him to kill for hell, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences with parole after 25 years. During the mid-90s, he amended his confession and claimed that he had been a member of a violent satanic cult that orchestrated the incidents as ritual murder and pleaded guilty to stabbing and attempting to murder others before the shootings had even begun. His letters are public and spine-chilling. Check them out. Real Riddler stuff. Quote, "I am the monster. I am Beelzebub. I am the chubby behemoth. Police, let me haunt you with this. I'll be back. I'll be back. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster." Okay, his violent spree led the legal system to create a new law called Son of Sam's Law, designed to create criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes, which at the time, he was basically a celebrity. He remains in prison to this day.
Coming in at number 3, we have Agnes Waterhouse. Agnes Waterhouse, otherwise known as Mother Waterhouse, was the first woman in England to be executed for witchcraft. Agnes confessed to being a witch and having a familiar named Satan, which was her cat. Later on, the cat apparently took the form of a toad. The familiar originally belonged to her friend and fellow witch Elizabeth Francis, but was later passed along to her. Furthermore, apparently Agnes would use her sorcery for evil. In 1566, she used her witchcraft to try and cause illness to a man named William Fine, and he was not so fine. After that, she used her powers to kill her enemies' livestock and as well as cause them illness. And lastly, she also tried to kill her husband using her powers. In fact, at her trial, one of her neighbors, a 12-year-old girl named Agnes Brown, came forward and testified against her. She claimed that she was visited by a demon dog under the control of Agnes Waterhouse. So according to the girl, one day she was visited by this demon that looked like a black dog with a face of an ape with a short tail, a set of horns, and a silver whistle around its neck. The demon dog appeared at her home and asked for some butter. She refused, and apparently later that day he returned with a knife and threatened to kill her. She said that he was going to thrust his knife in her heart and kill her. When the girl bravely asked to send him, the dog just turned his head toward Waterhouse's home. On July 29, 1566, Agnes Waterhouse was executed. Before doing so, she repented and begged God for forgiveness. She also did admit that she was sending her familiar to hurt and damage her neighbor's goods. But her neighbor, a tailor named Wardall, had such strong faith that the familiar was unable to mess with him. In the end, Agnes was hanged for her crimes. Moving on at number 2, we have Elizabeth Francis. So Elizabeth Francis was friends with Agnes Waterhouse. Some even say that they were sisters. I don't know. But she was accused around the same time that Agnes was. She was the original owner of Satan, the white spotted cat, and her familiar. According to Francis, she received the cat from her grandmother, who was also a witch. Her grandmother, in fact, was the person who taught her all about witchcraft when she was only 12 years old. According to Elizabeth, her cat would speak to her in a strange hollow voice and also would do anything in exchange for a drop of blood, which is why they could get him to do all of their dark bidding for them. During trial, Elizabeth confessed to stealing sheep and killing a number of people, including a man named Andrew Biles. Andrew refused to marry Elizabeth after she became pregnant with his child, so she killed him. Later on, her familiar told her to make a certain concoction of herbs and to drink it, and that would terminate her pregnancy. She did, and it worked. Not only that, but when Frances finally married, she got her familiar to kill her husband and her daughter. Agnes also confessed to using her powers and familiar to kill one of her own pigs to see, what it could do. And then she also killed her neighbor's cows and geese after they got in an argument. She got in an argument with the neighbor, not with the cows and geese, thought I should clarify. As I said before, the cat eventually turned to a toad on its own. So Frances was the first witch to be accused, and then she was the one who told everyone about Agnes in order to get a lighter sentence. So Elizabeth wasn't killed right off the bat. But 13 years later, she was accused again, and that's when she was killed for witchcraft. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Laurie Cabot. The story of Laurie Cabot is one that still blows my mind to this day. So Laurie is the high priestess of the Salem coven. She is well known among modern day witches. Now, Laurie would only ever use her powers for good and to help people. In fact, she was psychic, and she would use her psychic abilities in order to help police solve a number of crimes. The first time being during the disappearance and death of Martha Brailsford. So back in 1991, two people from Salem were reported missing. That was Martha Brailsford and her neighbor Tom Mamoni. Eventually, Tom returned home and said that the two were sailing when Martha fell off the boat after being hit by a rogue wave. So police began searching the bay for Martha, but they were unsuccessful. That's when one of the investigators who knew about Laurie and her abilities reached out to her for her help. Using just Martha's name, location, and birth, she was able to tune in and locate her. Laurie then said she got visions of Tom trying to make advances on Martha, but Martha was not into it. When she rejected him, he dragged her to the side of the boat and struck her head. He then put weights on her hips and attached an anchor to her feet and tossed her overboard. She even saw exactly where in the water Martha was. And guess what? She was right about all of that. A local fisherman ended up finding her body in the location that Laurie had said, and Martha did indeed have anchors and weights attached to her body. When Martha's body was located, Tom fled, and so Laurie was once again asked for help, but this time locating Tom. She once again tuned in and got a vision of Tom in a cabin, and got a vibe he was on his way to cross into Canada. Not only that, but Laurie performed a binding spell on Tom to make sure he would do something stupid so that he would get caught. Well, 3 days later, police found the cabin Tom was staying in, and it was in a small town near the Canadian border. They found the cabin because Tom made a stupid mistake. He parked his car near the cabin and he left the lights on. Neighbors called the cops because they didn't recognize the car and they knew the neighbors were out of town. Isn't that crazy? Starting off this countdown, we have Julia Brown. Julia Brown was a well-known voodoo practitioner and witch in her small town in Louisiana. People knew her for her charms and her curses, as well as the creepy songs that she would sing on her porch with her guitar. In her community, people would come to her and she would perform a number of different rituals for them. That was until people started to take advantage of her, so she started to get back at them. When they came to her, she would scare them by telling them predictions like they're gonna die soon or bad things were coming for them. Then the locals were like, "Hey, what's going on with her?" Close to her death, Julia started to act strange. She would constantly sing songs about her death and how she would get revenge on the town. One song that she would sing goes as so: "When I die, I take the whole town with me. When I die, I take the whole town." Not a very cheery and upbeat song if you ask me. In fact, no one knew what she was talking about until the day that she passed away. On September 29, 1952, Julia passed away. On that day, the town came together for her funeral. Well, as they were lowering her casket into the ground, rain came down hard. This rain later turned into a disastrous hurricane that wipes out the entire town. So it's believed that before she left, she put a curse on the town, which is what she meant by "when I die, I'm taking the whole town with me." Over the years, a number of people have attempted to rebuild the town, but every time they do, it ends up getting destroyed again. Maybe her curse is real then. In our fourth spot today, we have Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner is often called the father of modern witchcraft, and that's due to the fact that he founded Wicca. Although technically he learned it from a group of people and then went on to just write about it, so they gave him credit for it. But anyways, basically back in 1939 he said that one night he encountered a group of women who claimed to be witches. They stripped him of his clothes and put him in the middle of a ceremonial circle. The circle was lined with naked women, and they showed him their ways. From there, he learned briefly about Wicca and thought, hey, this is great, let's preserve this and make sure that everyone knows about it. In 1954, he actually created a book titled Witchcraft Today that teaches others how to embrace Wicca fully. He then went on and became obsessed with the occult. In fact, it's believed that a number of Wiccans and pagans were saved partly because of him. They could come out and be like, yeah, I'm a witch, without fear of being hanged or burned alive. To this day, he's one of the most relevant witches in history, but also one of the more controversial ones. In our third spot today, we have Mother Shipton. Mother Shipton, otherwise known as Ursula Sonthiel, was born in 1488 England. Legend has it that she was born during a massive thunderstorm and her mother gave birth to her in a cave. Her mother was only 15 at the time and was stuck raising Ursula in that cave by herself. That was until the monastery took her mother in and a local family took Ursula in. Eventually her mom was taken to a nunnery and they never saw each other again. Growing up, Ursula had a hard time fitting in. She had a large crooked nose, her back had a bend in it, and her legs were twisted. So right off the bat, people were like, yeah, she's a witch, just because of her appearance. In fact, people would bully her and call her hag face. Others believed her father was the devil. It didn't help that her mom refused to tell anyone who the father of her child was. So people were like, yeah, for sure, her father's the devil. Not only that, she would spend a lot of time by the cave that she was born in. Now, how did she get the name Mother Shipton? Well, eventually she went on to marry a man named Tobias Shipton, and she took his last name. She eventually did partake in witchcraft and would make magical remedies for the sick. So people called her Mother Shipton because she was like a mother to all. At one point in her life, she became psychic and could see into the future. Soon after, she was called the Narrenborough Witch. She made a living off of predicting and sharing the future with others. Moving on to number 2, we have Isobel Godey. Isobel Godey was a Scottish woman from Aldern, a village near the Scottish Highlands. She is well known in history because in 1662 she confessed to witchcraft and may have been executed. We actually don't know because there's no official record of it, so it's a mystery. Basically, during that time, if you were thought to be a witch, they would torture you until you admitted to being one, even if you weren't actually one. Well, Isabel's case sparked a lot of interest because she admitted to being a witch willingly without torture or anything. And she went into great detail on everything that she was doing. She gave 4 separate confessions given over a 6-week period. For example, she said she made a pact with the devil and had been engaging in intercourse with him. She also said that she was part of a coven and would cast spells on the community. She claimed she put a curse on some male authority figures who she felt victimized by. She also cursed her landlord for being a pervert and put one on the local church minister. Lastly, she also admitted that she had the ability to turn into animals and that she was interacting with fairies. Over the centuries, a number of people have analyzed Isobel and have come up with some explanations for her actions. One is that she suffered from psychosis or hallucinations, whereas others think it was a ploy to get maybe a more lenient sentence. But of course, you still have the people who believe that she was an actual witch and did everything that she admitted to doing. And in our number 1 spot today, we have La Voisin. Catherine Montvoisin, or La Voisin, was a witch that lived in France in the mid-1600s. Her witchcraft mainly comprised of mixing and creating potions, poisons, and medicines. She also would tell people their fortunes and would hold black masses where people could come and make contact with the devil through her. It started off with her just providing palm readings and advice for people, but then she realized that her clients were mainly women who were coming to her with spousal problems. A number of them wanted their husband dead, so she started creating the potions to help them kill their husbands and gain fortune. Then things started to get darker and darker. She began practicing dark magic and witchcraft. This involved her leading a number of satanic rituals in the catacombs under her home. One time she even spilt the blood of an innocent victim as a sacrifice for the devil. Eventually, Catherine was arrested for practicing witchcraft and for being involved in a number of murders. She was publicly burned at the stake in 1680.
Coming in at number 5, we have Circe. Circe was one of the most powerful sorceresses of Greek mythology, and she was the daughter of Hecate, and was also the cousin of Zeus, the king of Olympians. She was a goddess of warning and dark moon who came to the patroness of witchcraft. She was exiled onto an island where she learned the art of magic. Circe's magical abilities came from both potion making and spell casting. She quickly gained a reputation for trickery, being ill-tempered, and casting spells onto those who ridiculed and mocked her. Whoever disrespected her would be turned into an animal without the slightest effort on her behalf. It was her supernatural abilities that ultimately led to her exile on the remote island of Aeae. Said to be located off the southern coastline of Italy, about 100 kilometers from Rome, Circe was sentenced to this island for all of eternity as a punishment for practicing witchcraft onto Scylla. Circe had fallen in love with Glaucus, a sea god, who became infatuated with Scylla, so when Circe's advances and attempts at seduction failed miserably, she was put into a jealous rage. Circe then poisoned the water where Scylla bathed, and as a result, a hideous monster was born. When it was found out it was Circe, she was banished for the rest of her life from her immortal home and family. When on on the island she was found by Odysseus, who was on a route traveling home with his men. They eventually became lovers, even though Circe killed Odysseus' men with her powers. Some say she used her powers to tempt and seduce Odysseus to stay on the island with her, and became her lover. Since the days of ancient Greece, Circe's name has been used to describe witchcraft, seduction, and deception. She's been depicted in paintings over the years, tempting Odysseus, casting spells over his men, and practicing her dark arts to lure men and punish them, along with turning her enemies into hideous animal-like creatures. In at number 4 we have Morgan Le Fay. Morgan Le Fay was a powerful enchantress in the 5th and 6th century, and she was related to King Arthur and was said to be his magical savior and protector. She was believed to be a goddess, a witch, and a sorceress. Morgan is skilled and learned what useful properties all herbs contain, so that she had the ability to cure the ailments and illnesses in the body. She also could shapeshift and was able to fly. When King Arthur was wounded in battle, he was brought to her chamber, and she was easily able to cure him. So after that, she was committed to his care from then on. Morgan also uses her healing skills with various of Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, including Lancelot, who she fell in love with, and tried to seduce him, but he wasn't interested. Morgan showed Lancelot her incredible powers, and even though he had some powers as well, he was always defeated by the witch, and he described her as the most feared woman in the world. She soon is practicing more black magic and goes from helping and healing to becoming inherently evil. Morgan had the ability to communicate with the animals and sea creatures, ultimately giving her the name of the Empress of the Wilderness. When she began to demonstrate her magical powers, it's believed that Devil was her companion, and even brought Lucifer himself, disguising him as a dragon to destroy her enemies. Morgan is seen by many as a malicious and cruel sorceress, and some say that she was working to take over her King Arthur's throne through her harmful magic, scheming, and the ability to manipulate men. Most of the time, Morgan's witchcraft corresponds with those of other people, like Merlin's and the Lady of the Lakes, featuring the ability to shapeshift, illusion, and casting sleeping spells. In at number 3, Marie Laveau. Marie Laveau was born in early 1800, and she was a Louisiana practitioner of voodoo and is known as the Voodoo Witch of New Orleans. She was a dedicated practitioner of voodoo, as well as being a healer and herbalist, and is one of the most well-known practitioners of the voodoo art and culture. Marie didn't take long to dominate the voodoo culture and society in New Orleans areas, and being named the Queen of Voodoo. During her time practicing the art of voodoo, she would perform her services in such places like her home on St. Anne Street within Ghost Square and at Lake Pontchartrain Train, but it's unknown why she chose only these locations to perform her services. Many of her followers would call her for help with many things like family disputes, health, finances, and many other things. Once she was established in the art of voodoo, Marie opened her own beauty parlor where she worked as a hairdresser for wealthy families in New Orleans. It's believed that the occult part of her magic mixed Roman Catholic saints with African spirits and Native American spiritualism. Marie was also said to have owned a snake and named it Zombie after an African god. It is rumored that her magic was supported by a network of informants that she developed while working as a hairdresser in prominent white households. Marie excelled at obtaining inside information on her wealthy patrons by instilling fear in their servants, whom she either paid off or cured their mysterious ailments, and it was proven that she owned 7 slaves at one time. Marie was known to visit prisons to get death row prisoners ready for their execution, but she often would poison them herself after praying with them. The Queen of Voodoo died in 1881 at the age of 79, but she remains a legend today and is often referred to as one of the best to ever do it. Many famous musicians have written songs about or referring to Marie Laveau, and fun fact, in 1982 the famous punk rock band The Misfits were arrested and accused of attempting to exhume Marie from her grave after a local concert. In at 2 we have Moll Dyer. If you've seen the horror movie The Blair Witch Project, then you may already be familiar with the legend of the infamous Moll Dyer. She was a legendary 17th century resident of Leonardtown, Maryland, who was said to be a witch and accused of witchcraft and chased out of her home by the local townsfolk on a winter night. Her body was found a few days later, partially frozen to a large stone in the town of Allstate. It's believed that the rock itself is cursed, and people that go near it will experience dizziness and fainting. The legendary rock is located on the grounds of Tudor Hall, where the Historical Society has its headquarters. It is said that her spirit still haunts the land to this day, looking for the men who forced her from her home before her death. The land near her cabin is said to be cursed, never able to grow crops, and an unusual number of lightning strikes have been recorded near her home. A road 3 miles south of Leonardtown was named after her and is now known as Moldai Road, along with the creek which parallels the road being named Moldai's Run. A man who was hunting along the run in 1970 reported seeing a very dense fog patch, cylindrical in shape, and the light stretched 8 inches in length and crossed the stream and went east, moving across the wind instead with the wind, and then it turned and went south, and it happened not once but twice. Moldai was one of the historical figures that inspired the character in the Blair Witch Project, and she is the most well-known and famous witch in Maryland. The story of Moll has also been featured in the show American Supernatural in 2014, has inspired multiple books, and even in a Halloween ballet performance named The Legend of the Witch, performed from 1999 to 2006 in Maryland. In at number 1 we have Dion Fortune. Born Violet Mary Firth in 1890 in North Wales, Dion Fortune was a British occultist and author and said to be a modern-day witch. She wrote often about the occult in both fiction and both non-fictional stories. Dion possessed many abilities like contacting the dead, magical powers, and often had vision from her so-called past lives. Once she recalled having visions at the age of 4 of Atlantis, and she believed that was one of her past lives. In 1924 she founded the Fraternity of the Inner Light, a magical society dealing with religious philosophy and alternative realities. The fraternity's rituals were carried out under dim light, with Dion claiming bright light disperses etheric forces. A light would be placed on the altar while incense was burned, and the members would begin walking around the room chanting with the intent of building a psychic force. Next, the cosmic entities would be invoked, with the members believing that these entities would manifest in astral form and interact with the chosen ones. The magical principles on which her fraternity were based were adapted from the late 19th century Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, with other influences coming from Theosophy and Christian Science. The magical ceremonies performed by Dion's group were placed into 2 categories: initiation, in which the candidate was introduced to magical forces, and evocation, where these forces were manipulated for a given purpose. Dion died in 1924, leaving behind her magical society, which has survived to this day. Her novels in particular influenced on later occult and modern pagan groups such as Wicca. Author Ronald Hutton wrote a book called The Triumph of the Moon, A History of Modern Pagan Witchcraft, considers her the foremost female figure of British occultism. She is recognized by many as one of the most significant occultists and ceremonial magicians of the early 20th century. Coming in at number 5 we have Alice Keitler. Dame Alice Keitler was the first recorded person condemned for witchcraft in Ireland. Alice was born in the county of Kilkenny in Ireland in 1263 and had been married a total of 4 times. In 1302, Alice and her second husband were accused of killing her first husband, but due to her vast wealth and involvement in money lending, these accusations were dropped. When her fourth husband John Lepar fell ill in 1324, he expressed the suspicion that he was being poisoned by his wife. After his death, the children of John and Alice's past husbands accused her of using poison and sorcery. Along with these allegations, she was also accused of denying the faith of Christ and the church, cutting up animals to sacrifice to demons at crossroads, holding secret nocturnal meetings in churches to perform black magic and undermine and overpower the church, using sorcery and potions to control Christians, the murder of her past husband, and the possession of Robin Artisan, a lesser demon of Satan. Richard de la Dred, the Bishop of Ossory, sought to uphold the laws of the church and morality, so when the case of Alice Keitler came across him, he began an even larger project of addressing witchcraft. Richard made many attempts to have Alice arrested due to the many allegations against her and her use of witchcraft and black magic, but because of having powerful friends in the delay of the trial, Alice was able to flee, and it's believed that she fled to England but could never be found and arrested. Some of the people who were said to be working with Alice were captured and stood trial. One of them being one of her servants, Petronilla de Meth, who confessed to working with Alice in such things like committing heresy, sacrificing to demons, making love and hate potions to corrupt the church, engaging in affair with a demon and murdering her past husband. Alice was dark and manipulated many people around her to follow her and participate in witchcraft, and to this day it's not confirmed where she fled, but when she did, she was never seen again. In at number 4 we have Agnes Sampson. Agnes Sampson was a Scottish healer and a witch. She was involved in the North Berwick witch trials in the later part of the 16th century. Agnes lived in East Lothian, Scotland, and was considered to have healing powers and worked as a midwife. In the summer of 1590, King James VI was on a voyage from Denmark to Copenhagen after marrying Anne of Denmark, and on their way home a storm arose, and this made James believe the storm wasn't a coincidence. He believed that many people had unusual abilities and was greatly perplexed at the idea of witchcraft and black magic. So he began a witch hunt in Denmark, which was where the Copenhagen witch trials were started by the Danish admiral Peter Munk by King James's request. By By the autumn of 1590, Scotland was aflame with witch hunts, and many of those sent to trial were questioned by the king himself. Agnes was accused of being a witch by Gillis Duncan and was arrested along with others, and she was questioned heavily about her role in the storm raising. Agnes eventually confessed, and her body was shaved to reveal a witch's mark. Agnes Sampson had made a charm that she was able to raise a storm and change the winds. She confessed to causing a storm that drowned Jane Kennedy in September of 1589, when ferry boats collided during a sudden storm started by Agnes. The same charm raised the storm and weather effects that threatened the king on his return voyage from Denmark in 1590. King James actually was the one to interview Agnes and was very convinced of her guilt. She was convicted of witchcraft and was sent to be executed. She had been taken to a scaffold on Castle Hill, where she was strangled and then burnt at the stake in January of 1591. It is believed and seen by many locals that the naked ghost of a bold Agnes is said to roam in the palace of Holyrood House, haunting the people there. Coming in at number 3, we have Margaret Bien. Margaret Bien was a German woman convicted of witchcraft and perhaps the most famous of the victims in the Fulda witch trials in 1603 to 1605. Margaret was born in the city of Fulda, and she'd been married a total of 3 times and was the heiress of her first 2 husbands. In 1588, she had married her final husband, Blasius Bien, and moved to the city, but eventually returned after an apparent conflict with her husband's employer. At the time, Prince Abbot Balthasar von Dernbach, who had returned to power in 1602 after a long exile, ordered an immediate investigation of witchcraft in the city, after multiple reports and sightings. While in power, there were over 200 people who were executed for witchcraft in witch trials that lasted until his death in 1605. In March of 1603, the investigations resulted in the first wave of arrests in the city. On June 19th, Margaret was arrested and put into jail after signs of being involved with the devil and having supernatural abilities. Her current husband pointed out she was pregnant, but still that did not matter. It was actually believed that her current pregnancy was the result of intercourse with the devil himself. While in jail, she confessed to the murder of her second husband and her children with him and one of the member of her husband's employers, and that she had taken part in the Sabbath of Satan. Bien was convicted of witchcraft soon after her confession when it was burnt alive at the stake in Fulda in late 1603, and to this day she is still known as being one of the most dominant witches in Germany. In at number 2, we have Malin Motsdotter. Malin Motsdotter was a Swedish witch from 1613 to 1676. She is known as one of the few people in Sweden confirmed to have been executed by burning for witchcraft, and the only one to be executed by this method during the famous witch hunt known as the Great Noise in Sweden during 1668 to 1676, which had ended with her execution. Since 1668, a national witch hunt raged throughout Sweden ever since the accusation of Marit Jonsdotter, resulting in the establishment of witch commissions around the nation and execution of around 280 people. The accused showed signs of being witches, along with abducting children to the witches' Sabbath of Satan in Blockhula. Malin Motsdotter was among the accused, and not much is known about her background, but what we do know is that she had been married a couple of times and had 2 daughters with her first husband, Eric Nilsson. She was also known to work as a midwife and was actually hired by a woman named Anna Zippel, who actually accused of witchcraft as well and had been executed for being a witch. It's later found that Anna taught Malin the ways of witchcraft and sorcery. In 1676, Malin was reported for witchcraft by her 19-year-old daughter Maria. Malin was brought to trial for the accusation as her daughter Maria testified against her mother, stating that she had taken her and several other children to Satan in Blockhula, and that Satan himself, known to the children as the Mean One, appeared in court with horns standing next to her mother, holding her skirt, and whispered in her ear never to confess. Malin was ordered by the court to fall on her knees and pray, or be able to confess, but she didn't obey. Along with Maria, 10-year-old and 7-year-old both testified to have been abducted by Malin to Blockhula to see Satan. A woman named Gertrude also testified against Malin, stating that she had abducted her family to Satan 16 times and even another 14 times while she was in prison. Also, she had seen her family endure fits while being supernaturally beaten by Malin from prison. Malin's firm denial of these crimes was seen as a sign that the devil assisted the witch to withstand interrogations. Finally, in July of 1676, Malin was found guilty and sentenced to be executed. And finally, in at number 1, we have the Salem witches. The most well-known cases of witches in history, and you may have heard of them, are the witches from Salem. The Salem witch trials of 1692 are still widely talked about today. Witchcraft scared a lot of people throughout history. The thought The thought of people possessing supernatural powers was widely talked about, and many people were accused and labelled as witches. The Salem witch trials in particular were a series of hearings and prosecutions of people who were accused of witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused of possessing such abilities. A total of 30 people were found guilty, and 19 of them were executed by hanging. Among the 19 killed were 14 women and 5 men. Also, of the 200 accused, many were sent to jail, and at least 5 of them died there. Arrests were made in numerous other towns beyond Salem, like in Andover and Topsfield. The trials for the so-called capital crime were conducted by the Court of Eerie and Terminer in 1692, and by a Superior Court of Judicature in 1693. Both were held in Salem, where the mass hangings took place. This was the deadliest witch hunt in the history of colonial North America. Only 14 women and 2 men had been executed in Massachusetts and Connecticut during the 17th century who had been accused of witchcraft. Among the accused were Elizabeth Hubbard and also Dorothy Good, who were also accused of witchcraft. In February of 1692, Betty Parris and her cousin Abigail Williams, who were the daughter and niece of a respected Reverend Samuel Parris, started acting strangely, and would have fits described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural disease to affect by Minister John Hill. The girls screamed through things around the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into odd positions according to eyewitness accounts. The girls also complained of being pinched and pricked with pins, but when they went to a doctor, he could find no physical evidence of any ailment on either girl. After the news of these odd behaviors started spreading around Salem, other young girls began experiencing similar behaviors. No one had any idea of where these strange behaviors were coming from, or why the girls were acting in such an odd way. Massachusetts was a very religious town back then, and these girls were acting as if an ungodly being was inside of them. And so they had been accused of witchcraft, and many historians debate on how many of these 200 accused were actual witches, but some definitely were, and they had brought fear to the people of Salem.
Coming in at number 5, the Corwin Witch House. The Jonathan Corwin House in Salem, or simply known better as the Witch House, was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, 1640 to 1718, a prominent figure in the horrors that happened there, and is actually the only structure you can visit in Salem today that has direct ties to the Salem witch trials of 1692. Well, that might not be the case, because we got a couple of those coming up. Trust me, this place is riddled with ties to those witches. Corwin bought the house in 1675 and lived there for more than 40 years. The Witch House is a 350-year-old thick building with black painted timber, 2.5 stories tall, built to last, massive, and looming. Located at 310 Essex Street in the historic district of Salem, the house stands in testimony to the witch trials, and it's believed that the Witch House was used by Jonathan Corwin and others to actually interrogate those accused of witchcraft. The Witch House remained with the Corwins, of course, until the mid-1800s, yet there wasn't many family around to liven it up. The Corwin curse seems like a weird one, since all the Corwin's kids, 5 children, all perished young from separate complications within the house. And this is where it gets really weird. Not only is the place haunted to hell and back with specters seen in the attic upstairs and loud voices, arguments heard in the empty house at night, 8 Corwin lives were lost to premature death in that house. All Corwins. Yeah, I'd say that makes for a pretty cursed home, alright? A family curse. Number 4, Proctor's Ledge. There are over 1,000 documents from Salem witch trials, yet none of the accounts actually specify where the hangings took place. For many years it was believed that the 19 people who were executed in Salem were hanged at the summit of Gallows Hill, on the edge of town to the west, where the town would meet for large gatherings. Seems like after some homework, the hill alone would be too hard to climb, not an ideal spot to hear or see the live trials, and was too thick and heavily wooded. Maps of 1700 Salem show Gallows Hill marked on the map, but no actual marker for the execution site. I feel like a detective all of a sudden. A team of researchers began to reconsider all of the evidence around 2010, eras of homework collected over the years, and eventually concluded that the real execution spot was Proctor's Ledge. Boom, baby! This was confirmed in 2016. Part of the evidence included 1692 eyewitnesses' accounts who wrote in journals that they were able to see the hangings from their homes to actually remains being dug up and found now. Now I know what you're thinking, it's named after John Proctor. No, it's not. However, odd timing, as he was one of the witches accused of witchcraft along with 3 of his other mistresses. Locals say that the lady in white visits Proctor's Ledge. Some visitors claim to have caught the sight of her, though others catch only her disembodied voice. Are these the phantoms of the unsettled spirits tied to the grounds where they were hanged for eternity? Who knows? Number 3. Charter Street Burial Grounds. The Charter Street Burial Grounds started in 1637, also known as Old Burying Point or the Charter Street Cemetery, is the oldest cemetery in Salem. Many early and famous Salem residents are buried here, such as John Hawthorne, a judge in the Salem witch trials of 1692. Hawthorne, whose father had been a Salem magistrate, was born in 1641 and had 6 children. Hawthorne experienced several deaths in his family, including those of all his 3 brothers. Hawthorne died in 1717 at the age of 76, never apologizing for the role in the Salem witch trials. His headstone is surrounded by granite rectangles to help preserve what is left of the original stone. Being one of the oldest cemeteries and the sickening things that happen there, ghosts and spirits are often seen around the gravesite. There have been many strange occurrences here. Witch stuff aside, about 400 years of ghostly encounters have happened at the Old Burying Point Cemetery. Over the years, people have successfully captured EVP of voices from beyond the grave at the site. If you can hear me, say something. Stop yelling. Oh, sorry. Photographs of mysterious shadows, orbs, white mist, and even full apparitions are seen here. One of these apparitions is believed to be Mary Bright Corey, who died 1684. She was the second wife of Giles Corey, who later became an unfortunate victim of the witch trials himself. Another ghost seen is the powdered blue dress lady, whilst holding a picnic basket in one hand and sometimes accompanied by a young boy. Normally, once the cameras come out, the lady in white transitions into numerous bright orbs or vanishes altogether. Maybe the ghost woman is the same Mary Corey forever watching over Judge Hawthorne's grave. Number 2. Gallows Hill. Okay, so we were just talking about what happened to some of the accused during these hysterical trials and all the historical places that saw such violence. One of the most interesting witches tried of that was Giles Corey. Tried as a witch but never hanged. Actually, the old man known as Giles Corey was pressed to death with the judge's orders of him being a strong and stubborn old man and would not for the life of him indulge in the nonsense he was being accused for. He never admitted that he was a witch. Even throughout his torture, they laid him down and put a board on his back and proceeded to stone him to death, piling up stones on the board, resulting in crushing and eventually perishing underneath it. Only took about 4 days. Giles Corey apparently repeatedly yelled more weight, further cementing his plea of not guilty to everyone watching at Gallows Hill. With his last breath, Giles apparently cursed the town of Salem, and this area is now an unearthly hotspot for paranormal activity. The Gallows Hill that most people are aware of is nothing but a baseball diamond, but underneath that baseball diamond, bone fragments and coffins have been found. Interesting, because no witches were ever buried in coffins. Maybe vampires? Giles died from his inflicted torture on September 19th, 1692, just after the 8th anniversary of his wife Mary's passing. Strange sounds emerge from the area at night, including loud knockings, thumpings that wake up neighbors from their bed, and of course, the full-bodied apparitions said to walk the grounds yelling in the middle of the night. There have been full-bodied apparitions spotted within the woods, with disembodied voices shrieking in the middle of the night. The disturbingly loud voices yelled throughout the area have had some locals scratching their heads. Is this the ghost of Giles himself, speaking his curse upon the town for all to hear? Shh! Trying to sleep! And coming in at number 1, House of Seven Gables. Locals say the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, or also known as famously the House of Seven Gables, is the most haunted spot in Salem. How many haunted spots are there? Ghosts are just like really competitive. Now a prominent museum, protected in its original form, used for plays and reenactments by the locals, the original structure was simple in nature, with only 2.5 rooms and just under 3 stories tall. By the time of John Turner's death, the prominent merchant, sea captain, and owner of the house, he was one of the most wealthy men in the entirety of Massachusetts. Turner and Ingersoll's House of the Seven Gables is a ghostly reminder of the tormented souls both trying and being tried at the time of the hangings. But the Turner Ingersoll is a reminder for more than just lost shipping fortunes and curses, as it's also a homely reminder of Judge Hawthorne himself and the guilt he inflicted on that town. As records show, Hawthorne may have feigned sympathy for the accused witches, but he never regretted his involvement in their trials or executions. And he certainly never expressed any remorse during the trials themselves for sending the accused to their death. Following the witch hysteria of the late 1600s, the Hawthorne family lost most of their wealth, no doubt influenced by the families of the accused witches who sought out justice for their dead loved ones. Acting now is only a museum of historic place. Each year, the museum hosts a series of theatrical plays, all of which surrounding the Salem witch trials. Such plays titled as Legacy of the Hanging, Judge Hawthorne, and Spirits of the Gables. But some of the actors aren't, well, very alive. As for the ghosts outside of the theatrical performances, well, everybody's got their own opinions on that, but tour guides and employees tend to avoid the attic, where some people have complained about being choked by ghostly figures. Local lore has many different stories to tell, and so do many of the visitors who enter Salem's most haunted house. Others report seeing a phantom boy who enjoys playing in the attic. Throughout the day, his giggles and laughs can be heard. Always giggling kids, eh? They're like the scariest ghosts. Well, that's about all the proof and lore I need to believe it. Imagine doing a show and a ghost just saying, line?
Number 5 on this list is a super weapon. One thing that's widely believed about Area 51 is that for a while it was used as a place to develop and test nuclear weapons. Located out in the middle of the desert, very secluded, it made for the perfect spot to develop such deadly weapons. As time went on and the Cold War quieted down, there was less of an emphasis on manufacturing such bombs. In fact, dismantling these bombs has been something that's been going on for quite some time in an effort to make sure we avoid nuclear annihilation of the entire planet. This is all well and good and probably the best thing for all of us. But some believe that this site is kept so secret because there's another type of weapon at play. Nobody knows exactly what it could be, but some people speculate that the United States government specifically uses this site as a place to develop a super weapon. Something that the world would have never seen before. Whether this weapon would take the place of a bomb or a gun or a pathogen is currently unknown, but it would dwarf the atomic bomb in deadliness for sure. Dismantling all atomic bombs looks really good in the tabloids. Making a massive super weapon that could destroy entire countries doesn't look nearly as good. This is why the government has made it their mission to keep it all under wraps. Also, if word got out that the government was trying to make some sort of super weapon, well, it doesn't matter what the actual intentions behind the weapon are, other countries would interpret that as very threatening. They would then either need to build their own super weapon or try to stop America from ever completing the construction of theirs. Both of these scenarios would be very bad for humanity and is definitely something that the American government would want to avoid. I have no idea what this super weapon could be or what it could entail, but if America was making something like this, you have to imagine that Area 51 would be the spot for it. Number 4 on this list is the moon landing. With the Cold War at its height and the space race in full swing, the United States in 1969 made the first successful moon landing in human history. Or at least, that's what they wanted us to think. Ever since the moon landing took place, conspiracy theories of its validity have run rampant. Many people believe that the Americans never really landed on the moon in 1969, but just faked the whole thing to get a leg up in the Cold War. Most people believe that Area 51 was the site where they filmed the whole thing. Area 51 is a massive space that's super closed off to the public. This would be the perfect location to film something like the moon landing if you ever were to do such a thing. You wouldn't want to draw attention to a set like this, so renting out a studio in LA probably wouldn't have been the best idea. If this is true, then it also begs the question, how many other things have been doctored here? Does the United States regularly film stuff here that isn't real and then release that to the public? Unless somebody comes out from the film crew that made this fake video, sadly, we probably won't ever know. Number 3 on this list is mutant experiments. Aliens are obviously the first thing that we think about when it comes to Area 51, but maybe there are some other strange creatures that are hiding at this base. If you've ever seen the show Stranger Things or are regular on videos like this, then I imagine you've probably heard of the project MK Ultra. If you haven't, then this was an illegal project conducted by the CIA starting in the 50s to try and wield the power of mind control. Through a series of horrible experiments, the CIA would take people, often give them large amounts of hallucinogens, and then subject them to forms of psychological torture. Lots of the people that took part in these experiments were horribly scarred for life, and most of them never recovered. This whole process broke so many human rights violations and really was not a good look for the American government. They eventually stopped in the 70s, and when this info was finally released to the public, faced some pretty bad backlash because of it. Experiments of this nature may not be happening anymore, but many have speculated that something similar could very easily be going on at Area 51. In 2018, new documents were released about MKUltra, and it showed that the CIA had 6 dogs run, then stop, then all turn around and run back, all from implanting brain chips in them. Is it possible that something similar is going on here, where maybe they're making some mutant controllable animal? What about experiments involving humans that the government doesn't want reaching the public? If they've done it before, then there's no reason to think that they aren't capable of doing it now. Maybe these experiments don't involve mind control, but potentially taking some characteristics of an animal and putting them into a human. We've seen over the past decades a growing interest in mutant animals, so there's no reason to think that one bright scientist wouldn't want to try this with people as well. We obviously don't know for sure, but a secluded, secretive base in the desert is pretty much the perfect spot to perform mutant experiments if you ever were to do such a thing. Number 2 on this list is the Roswell incident. According to Wikipedia, the Roswell incident is the 1947 recovery of balloon debris from a ranch near Corona, New Mexico by United States Army Air Forces officers from Roswell Army Airfield, and the conspiracy theories decades later claiming that the debris involved a flying saucer and that the truth had been covered up by the United States government. Well, many people believe that this apparent flying saucer is currently residing in Area 51. This is what you've heard about Area 51 for. This is where it's got its big name: alien tech. This site is used as a secret base to investigate alien technology. This alien tech is getting regularly tested and experimented with by the government at this site. Some believe that America got these UFOs, brought them to this site, and now are trying to reconstruct them and use that technology to build their own advanced spacecraft. Whether the spaceships that they're in possession of have advanced weaponry on them, that's unknown, but one has to imagine that they would contribute to warfare in some capacity. One also has to imagine that if America got access to flying saucers in 1947, that they've probably succeeded by now in their attempts at remanufacturing said flying saucers. Who knows what sort of crazy otherworldly tech is being stored in Area 51 that is super top secret? How much does the government actually know about extraterrestrial life that they aren't telling you? I can't say for sure, but I'd hedge my bets that the answers are in that base. Number 1 on this list is aliens. We just talked about how they probably have alien tech chilling at Area 51. Well, how about the actual extraterrestrials who made that tech? Many people believe that Area 51 is not only a spot for testing alien equipment, but also a holding spot for any aliens that the government has come into contact with. It's very likely that these aliens are already dead, but I also don't see why it wouldn't be possible for them to potentially have some of these aliens alive and just locked up. Having alien life locked up in a very secret base is something that you wouldn't want getting out to the public, but it isn't just humans you'd need to worry about. If this is true, and this info was confirmed and then leaked to the public, well, I can only imagine the species of alien that our prisoner belongs to would want to get their friend back. If they were intelligent enough to get to this planet with supposed advanced technology, then we can only assume that they're a superior being to us. Having a superior being pissed off with the entirety of the human race probably isn't the best idea and something that should be avoided at all costs. Also, even if this alien's friends didn't care and just left their buddy behind, well, the panic and chaos that this would cause in the world would be insane. One would have to assume that other countries would be demanding to investigate the alien for themselves, that the global public would want answers and would be irate if we didn't get them, that people would start to lose their minds worrying about the possibility of aliens attacking the planet. It makes perfect sense why the American government wouldn't want people to know about such a thing. And honestly, when I think about it more, maybe ignorance truly is bliss when it comes to Area 51. Number 5 on this list is Goody Cole. Now, Goody Cole is a little interesting because today she is not a physical witch, but the ghost of her former witch-like self. Back in the 1600s in Hampton in the United States, Goody Cole lived with her older husband at the time. Once 1656 rolled around though, she didn't live with him anymore. Goody Cole was arrested and found guilty of witchcraft. It was said that she had a mumbling habit, looked extremely witch-like, and also had some animal-related deaths tracked back to her in what would have been used for apparent rituals. It was also said that she was capable of turning herself into an animal and would often do so to disguise herself and trick others. When she was arrested, she was treated extremely poorly, often tortured, starved, and this whole process went on for years. After 6 years of this, she petitioned to be released so that she could support her husband, who was was close to death at the time. The court agreed that they would let her do this, but she had to pay a sizable fee that she obviously didn't have access to because she was in jail. Her husband eventually died alone without the support of his wife, something that was said to eat at Goody's conscience continually. Now, the manner of Goody Cole's death is sort of up in the air. Some say that she was stabbed with a stake for being a witch. Others say that she was finally released, but she was so old that she died in her home alone soon after, whereas some people say that she just died in prison. But one thing's for certain, Goody Cole was so unhappy with the people of Hampton actually that she never left. Many people in the area have reported in the older parts of town that they still see a dark, shadowy figure resembling an old woman. A phantom all in white that stalks people through the streets and can be seen in the windows looking down upon you as you walk through the city. People believe that this witch won't cause you any harm, but her goal is to make you feel as ostracized as possible, the exact way that she was made to feel back when she was still living. Number 4 on this list are the boo hags. Typically associated with the haunting of the coastal plains of South Carolina, it should be noted that there's no reason to believe that they could only be limited to this area, but there has been a large amount of activity of them here. Now, I should also note that the jury is still a little bit out on if these creatures are exclusively witches or exclusively vampires. I think that the truth of the matter is probably a horrifying mixture of both. Legend says that the boo hag needs to get sustenance from a person's breath, and that's how they sustain themselves. This action is somewhat similar to how the Dementors act in Harry Potter, but still with some notable differences. For starters, a boo hag is a fleshy creature that does not have any skin of its own. Therefore, it is simply a red tendon-esque humanoid being. Because they don't have any skin of their own, they will often steal the skin of their victims and fit it to their bodies until that skin inevitably deteriorates. The action of sucking someone's breath isn't as simple as my Harry Potter example either. Typically, once a boo hag finds a suitable victim, they will stalk that individual back to their home and wait until they're sleeping. Once they're passed out, the boo hag will break into their home and straddle the person who is asleep. This action is referred to by locals as a riding from a boo hag. Now, if the person wakes during this process and struggles, they will steal your skin and leave you for dead, but oftentimes you don't even realize that this is happening to you. They will suck your energy and it will put you into a deep catatonic-like state. After they've gotten their necessary energy, they'll leave you alone, and you'll wake the next morning feeling drowsy, most likely, not even realizing that you were ridden from a boo hag. Number 3 on this list is the White Witch of the Rose Hall Plantation in Jamaica. The Rose Hall Plantation is near Montego Bay. However, the witch in question is the ghost of a witch named Annie Palmer, and Annie Palmer wasn't from Jamaica at all. In fact, Annie Palmer spent most of her life in Haiti. She was born there and lived there with her parents for quite some time until they sadly passed away due to yellow fever. Afterwards, she was adopted by a witch who wasn't shy in passing her gifts on to young Annie. Regularly practicing witchcraft and voodoo, Annie soon became a strong witch in her own right. After she grew up, she moved to Jamaica and married John Palmer, taking his last name. Now, this is where things get a little bit crazy though. Annie murdered John Palmer. Then she got married again and murdered that husband. And then she got married again and murdered that husband. You'd think that these guys would have recognized that marrying Annie might not have been the best idea, but I guess love just conquers all. Annie didn't stop with her husbands though. She murdered countless slaves that worked on that plantation. This was right up until she was murdered herself by a slave named Taku. The people back then attempted to perform a voodoo ritual on this witch, not wanting to have her ever return again. However, it didn't work the way that they intended it to. The voodoo ritual actually trapped her at this location, and now she's said to be forever haunting the Rose Hall on Montego Bay. People have seen her ghost before, and they've heard screaming coming from nothing. The vision of a woman in white will appear sometimes, and it is said that if you stay at this plantation too long, then some deep misfortune will fall upon you or your family. So beware. Number 2 on this list is Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth is a witch in British folklore that is said to haunt the waters of Lancashire, Cheshire, and Shropshire. I know, it's a lot of shires. Jenny is a river witch and lives in the rivers of these areas looking for victims to drag down with her. As you'd imagine, with a name like Greenteeth, her appearance is pretty grotesque. Green algae-like hair, a wrinkled witchy face, skin that is the same color as a bog and a weird, fleshy exterior, Jenny is certainly not a looker. But I suppose it doesn't matter a whole lot, as she uses the swamp like water and pond scum to mask her appearance so you can't see her beneath the filth. The origin of Jenny Greenteeth is still up for debate, but the bare bones of the tale are pretty consistent. Jenny was a girl in a local British town who was the victim to some heavy bullying. One day when she was at her job getting water from the well, somebody yelled at her that they hope she falls in and dies. Well, that's exactly what happened. Her spirit manifested as Jenny Greenteeth, this old hag who now haunts the waters in this area. Jenny is not simply a harmless witch either. She preys on people, specifically children that get too close to the water. Sometimes she will try to lure them towards the riverbank by calling out to them or singing a tune where no one can figure out where it's coming from. Now, this tactic is one that we've talked about on this channel before with the Utah water babies and is very successful. She lunges her hand out and grabs them, dragging them into the water where they will drown and never be seen again. This water witch is known by all the locals in the area, with everyone having some slightly different adaptations to the legend. General consensus though, if you hear someone singing from the rivers of Britain, don't go near it. Number 1 on this list is La Lechuza. La Lechuza is a witch based in Mexican folklore that is said to haunt the Mexican nights. I wish I could pinpoint the location down for you guys to be a specific region in Mexico, but this witch is sadly far too mobile for that. La Lechuza used to live in a small Mexican town and regularly practice witchcraft. Her intentions were foul though, and would regularly cause harm to others, whether that be to them directly or to their livelihood. The townsfolk, once they discovered that she was the cause of their misfortune, raided her home and viciously murdered her. They didn't kill her well enough though, because her spirit still clings to life to this day. Said to regularly take the form of an owl and fly throughout Mexico, La Lechuza is constantly on the hunt for food. Her preferred meal is young men. This bird is apparently massive, and once it sets its sights on you, it will be nearly impossible to escape. Some people have reported that she is so big that they've seen her run cars off of the road and eat her victims in the wreck. She also employs some other tactics instead of just brute force. Sometimes she will mask her voice as a baby and sit outside your door until you open it, and then she'll pounce. You may also hear the consistent racket of an owl howling in the night. Go and check your window to see what the commotion is and become this owl lady's dinner. Basically, she is a giant owl that you can't run from, you can't beat in a fight, and is also able to outwit you with some strange tactics. She haunts all of Mexico, and you just need to hope that if you were there, she doesn't pick you to be her next meal. Number 5 on this list is the prayer test. This test basically acts as the single most important audition of your life. It was thought that witches were unable to recite the word of God, and that reading or speaking the Bible would cause their immediate demise. Therefore, they would have accused witches come to the front of the court or gathering and recite verses from the Bible. Now, this test makes a decent amount of sense if you think about it, although we can't forget what era we were in when this took place. Not everyone was literate at this time. In fact, a lot of them weren't. I can also imagine the immense pressure that you would feel to perform that verse to perfection. Speaking as somebody who's been through their fair share of auditions in life, I can tell you that auditions are nerve-wracking to begin with, but add on the fact that your life is on the line, that really raises the stakes, I think. And it wasn't enough to have you simply not go up in flames as you were reading it. A simple slip-up, a mispronunciation, a little pause, all of these things were evidence that the accused was a witch and was struggling to get through the verse. The crazy thing about this as well is that even if you did recite this verse flawlessly without fail, you might still be put to death anyways. George Burroughs had to perform this test during the Salem trials, and even after he absolutely nailed it, they still killed him. The people were so convinced that he was a witch who needed to die that they chalked up his performance as being a devilish trick and killed him regardless. Number 4 on this list is witch cakes. Witch cakes are pretty unique in how they were administered because your fate wasn't decided by a person or the cake itself. It was actually by a dog. Now, I feel for these pups because they had to eat these concoctions and they aren't palatable at all. What people would do is take a sample of the victim's urine, so the person presumably being affected by the witch, take a sample of their urine, and then they take some rye meal and a sprinkle of ashes, and that's it. Take those 3 things, mix them together, toss them in the oven, and then bake it up. Now, I don't really know where they got the idea that urine and ashes would tell us anything about these witches, but that's the conclusion that they got. They then take the dog, and it was thought that dogs were not only man's best friend, but actually witches' best friends as well. That dogs back in the day had some sort of tie to witches, and that they were supporters of witches. So you take this witch cake, you feed it to the dog, and now you just observe that dog's behavior, and the accused witch has to just cross their fingers that this dog doesn't start acting weirdly, biting, barking at nothing, just generally acting strangely. It was thought that if the dog did this or exhibited any of the same symptoms that the victim was experiencing, then witchcraft was assuredly at foot, and then we can start pointing fingers. I gotta say though that I seriously feel for the dog in this instance, because I mean the poor guy did literally nothing at all, and now he's gotta eat this urine cake that may or may not curse him with something. So yeah, the dog's got it rough here, guys. Number 3 on this list is called the touch test. Witches were said to have the ability to control other people. Basically, they could cast a spell on you and you're now either under their control or in a lot of pain. If these witches were to touch the person who's believed to be under their curse or spell though, then that individual would have some type of response. Let's say someone who's controlled by these witches starts acting strange or frantic. Then a simple touch by the witch would calm them completely. I'm not really sure if this theory on witches and touching their victims has been founded by anything or is true to this day, but back then they definitely believed that this was the case. The problem with this test though was that there was a lot of wannabe actors back then. In 1662, there were 2 older women who were being accused of witchcraft. Their names were Amy Denny and Rose Cullender. Now, they had reportedly cursed some young girls and were causing them serious harm, which manifested itself in the way of seizures. These girls would have seizures, but it was believed that if the witch who was possessing them, so Amy and Rose, were to touch them, then the seizure would stop immediately. Well, sure enough, this was tested in court, and it actually worked. The second that the old women touched these girls, the seizures stopped immediately and their hands just grew completely soft and totally calm. But let's not kill them just yet. They then blindfolded the young girls and did the exact same experiment, but now with other people subbing in and touching them. Well, it turns out the girls were faking and would stop seizuring to other people who touched them instead of just the older women. Perfect. So Amy and Rose, they can't possibly be witches then. We ran the test, they passed, they should be set free. Maybe in today's world that's what would happen, but not in 1662. Both of them were hung anyways, and the young girls got off scot-free. Number 2 on this list is called pricking. This was a horrible test that was basically just a glorified means of torture. Now, I'm sure that most of you know what a witch mark is, but if you don't, then it's basically a mark from the devil that indicates you have a pact with Satan, and witches have these on their bodies. However, if there's an accused witch that doesn't have a witch mark, that doesn't mean that they're off the hook. It's possible that they still have a witch mark. It's just hard to see, or it can't be seen to the naked eye. Well, if this was the case, then you need a professional pricker, right? A professional pricker is someone who works solely on discovering witches' marks. That's right, guys, this was so common that they actually had a career path that came out of it. It was believed that a witch's mark didn't feel any pain and in turn wouldn't show any signs of weaknesses. Therefore, if you pricked them with a sharp point, then the person wouldn't be in any pain and no blood would come from this prick. So professional prickers would have their accused witches and they would just take their chosen sharp object and just stab them until you had a spot that didn't bleed. And then, because you didn't bleed, they would kill you for being a witch anyways. It also didn't stop at just pricking, but it even went to scratching as well. The victim of an apparent witch would be allowed to come and scratch that witch until they drew blood. This was supposed to cause the victim some relief from their symptoms, and if it did, then that would be enough to make the accused person guilty of witchcraft and they would be executed. Yeah, you really did not want to get stuck with the pricking test. Number 1 on this list is the swimming test. Now this is one that I'm sure most of you have already heard about, but it has to be on this list based on just simply how ridiculous it was. Now even though in hindsight this test was nuts, I do kind of understand the logic of how they got there in the first place. It was believed back then that witches had rebuffed the sacrament of Christ, meaning that baptism was definitely a no-go for a witch. Because water is tied heavily to baptism, the logic followed that if you were a witch and you were thrown into the water, then the water would reject your body from entering, and therefore you would float to the top of it. To test this theory, they would take their suspected witches, strip them down naked, hog tie their limbs, and then throw you into the water, and if you floated, then you're a witch, but if you sank, you're just a person. Again guys, this kind of makes sense, except for the people who weren't actually witches and sank to the bottom. Now I should note that they would sometimes tie a rope around your body, and if you sank, they would pull you back up to the top. But this only happened sometimes. Other times they would just throw you in, and if you sank and drowned, then oh well, I mean, you drowned now and at least you weren't a witch. Also, this tying of the rope wasn't a perfect science either. A lot of times people who sank would drown anyways as they were being pulled up. Basically, just the accusation of being a witch meant that you would be sentenced to death, because if you did somehow manage to float, then now you're a witch and you're gonna be burned or hung, and if you did sink, as most people did, then you'd probably just drown. Sometimes, even if you did sink and you did then get pulled back up to the top and survived, they would just kill you anyways. Back then, if more than one person accused you of being a witch, then you were pretty much as good as dead. Number 5 on this list is what I'm going to be nicknaming the Scottish Witch from the Woods. I stumbled across a Scottish story about a witch where they were unable to discover her name. Hundreds of years ago, when Scotland was still being first developed, there was a village in the north of the country. This village was positioned directly next to a forest that they wanted to chop down and expand into. When they began their process of chopping down the forest, a witch, or the Witch of the Woods, came out and warned them that if they continued, she would curse their entire community. The women would become infertile, the crops would never grow, and people would go missing. Fearing for their safety, the group came to an agreement with this witch, where they were allowed to chop down a small section of the forest in exchange for leaving one sack every harvest of grain or produce by the edge of the forest. This agreement held true for quite a while until the community started to get less fearful and more greedy. They decided to go against this witch and chop down the rest of the forest without fear of consequence. When the witch came out of the forest again to address their betrayal, they refused to listen, and they hung her immediately. Right before she was executed though, she said that the new price was 3 bags of grain. This fell on deaf ears though, except for one fearful farmer that decided to heed the warning for a little while. The community went on thriving until once again that farmer's fear was replaced with greed. He stopped delivering the grain, and that very same day his youngest daughter went missing. The community looked everywhere, but nobody could find her until somebody checked the mill. Through the bricks and all over the walls, blood started dripping down to the ground, and they knew exactly where his daughter went. That mill has since been torn down, but it was replaced with a silo, and to this day, the locals in that area still think that that silo is haunted by the Scottish Witch in the Woods. Number 4 on this list goes to the Paisley Witches. The Paisley Witches are actually nicknamed after the town of Paisley in Scotland, where these witches were based. Christian Shaw was an 11-year-old girl who was the daughter of a higher up in the Scottish community. It was this 11-year-old girl who fell victim to the curse of several witches. It started with a deep sickness that manufactured itself like any other: fevers, chills, exhaustion. But some reports say that it became much more than that. The story goes that Shaw on one occasion levitated from her bed, and on another occasion started chanting some deep curse. It was clear to everybody involved, including Shaw, that some form of Scottish witchcraft was afoot. Now she made it evident that she believed multiple witches were involved in causing her ailment, 7 of them in fact. A trial was held for these witches where it was discovered that they all had the witch's mark, or the devil's mark as some like to call it, on their bodies. After this evidence came to light, the jury's decision was easy and all of the witches were sentenced to death. Now this story was a long time ago, and it's hard to know for certain whether these individuals had anything to do with Shaw's ailment and witchcraft, or if they were wrongly accused, tried improperly, and the story has been exaggerated over time, which frankly is not unlike other potential witch stories during this period. The only thing that we can say for certain though is that the people back then and the 11-year-old Christian Shaw believed wholeheartedly that this group of Paisley witches was just that: witches. Number 3 on this list is Helen Duncan. Helen Duncan was a Scottish witch who traveled throughout Europe and actually isn't that far removed from present day. She died in 1956 and is known by some to be the last Scottish witch. As a young girl, she was considered by most to be a normal, albeit outspoken and loud, growing child. It wasn't until midway through her life that she started seriously practicing witchcraft. Helen garnered a name for herself by regularly performing seances every evening and having the ability to communicate with the dead. During her nightly rituals, she would invite viewers to come and watch. These viewers had reported seeing the materialization of ghostly figures directly in front of their eyes when Helen entered her deep witchly trance. Helen was also capable of and would often excrete a strange-looking ectoplasm from her mouth while she was doing this. And if this wasn't enough, Duncan could also see things that others couldn't. At one point, the ghost of a sailor appeared and talked about a very secretive incident that had happened in World War II that the public, or Helen Duncan, couldn't have possibly known about. After hearing this information, the authorities realized that they couldn't have Duncan revealing any important state secrets about the war and arrested her for witchcraft immediately. It was revealed during her trial that some of her witchy ways were not what people were led to believe though. Like her ectoplasm was simply the regurgitation of a cheesecloth made to look like some type of ghostly substance. Even though some of her abilities were proven to be fraudulent, it still doesn't explain how she was able to accurately predict or say the things that she couldn't have possibly known. Helen Duncan didn't use any of her abilities to harm anyone, but the capability to potentially talk to the dead, it's still very chilling. Number 2 on this list is Thomas Weir and his sister Grizel. What makes Thomas and his sister so scary is that nobody expected them to be involved in witchcraft at all. Up until the end of his life, Thomas was known by most to be a nice man of the community held in high esteem. However, nearing the end of his life, Thomas came clean about who he really was, telling the entire community during a religious service that he and his sister had been performing witchcraft for years, going into deep detail about how they had consistent communication with the devil and had devoted their entire lives to carrying out his bidding. This bidding manifested itself in many different ways, most of which involved causing harm to others, or in Thomas's case, getting it on with animals. Yeah. He was a weird dude. At first, the community barely believed him, but after the sister came out and corroborated his story in detail as well, they started piecing it together. Thomas was always walking around with a big black staff. The neighbors had reported hearing strange sounds in the evening coming from their home and weird lights going off. Suddenly, the guy that everybody thought they knew as their nice, friendly neighbor was somebody else entirely. Reports say that when he was burned at the stake, he took far longer to die than a human should. Also, his staff was burned with him, and it emitted an extremely strange sound and moved in unnatural directions when it was burning, as if it was being possessed by some force. I suppose that in the case of Thomas and Grizel, they had done such a good job at hiding their identities as witches and had been extremely methodical with their crimes, that before they died, they just had to let the world know just how evil they actually were. Number 1 on this list is Isabel Gowdie. Isabel was a Scottish witch from the 1600s, and frankly, she did everything. Through several confessions that she made on her own accord, without the pressure of torture or coercion from higher ups, Isabel admitted to taking part in a wide array of witchcraft activities. She admitted that she had freely let the devil suck blood from her neck and that she had romantic relationships with the devil before. She admitted to taking the body out of child's graves and using it in a ritual to destroy people's crops. She said that she had made clay effigies or voodoo dolls of someone's children and used these to harm and even kill them. Isabel was also part of a coven, a group of witches whose intentions were evil and had the ability to change their form into animals. She described in detail the brutal murders that she had committed for the devil and her fellow witches. She even offered up information about spells they had used to inflict illnesses on people, uttering some of them to the council she was confessing to. Now, it's unclear exactly why Isabel decided to confess to these heinous crimes and oust herself as being a witch. She had to be aware that confessing to these crimes of this nature would surely mean her execution. It had been said, though, that she felt extreme guilt for her crimes, and that's why she decided to come forward and accept the consequences as they were. Regardless of what her intentions were, though, Isabel Gowdie has to go down as one of the most dangerous known witches in Scottish history.
Starting off this countdown, we have the North Berwick Witches. North Berwick is a small town in Scotland where some of the most brutal and horrific witch trials took place. It all started during the reign of King James VI. While on his way to get his new bride in 1589, he encountered a series of disastrous storms. In fact, the storms were so bad that he was forced to head back home. He immediately thought that the storms were the work of witches. It didn't help that back then a rumor had started that a witch had sailed out on the River Forth to conjure up some storms. So from then on, King James was dead set on finding these witches. In fact, 70 to 200 women were accused of being witches. Most of them were tortured and then executed. Now, apparently during these trials, he did come across a number of women that admitted to being witches. They claimed that they had all made deals with the devil and were now under his command. They also claimed that they would use one of the churches there to hold their covens. They even said that this was the place where they had summoned the devil himself. In fact, this church was located right on the seafront, so James was like, aha! The perfect place to conjure up storms, all of you are guilty. As a result, these witches were strangled and then burnt at the stake. In our fourth spot today, we have Sabrina Spellman. Although she's a fictional character, Sabrina still deserves a spot on today's list. Without too many spoilers, the show The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is about Sabrina, a teenage witch who on her 16th birthday has to sign her name in the Book of the Beast. Upon doing so, she makes a deal with Satan. She basically gives herself to him in exchange for magical powers. At first, Sabrina refused to do so because she didn't want to give up her mortal life, but later on she was forced into doing it in order to stop a number of evil forces that were murdering many of the townsfolk. Once she signed the book, she is forced to do Satan's bidding. She has to basically bow down to him and do whatever he instructs her to do. In return, Sabrina's magic became even stronger. In fact, she became the fourth witch in all of history to summon demonic blue hellfire, which was then used in order to fight off the Greendale 13. And for her to do that as a relatively new witch is very impressive. Later on in the show, we also realize that Miss Wardwell is evil and is using Sabrina so she can become the Queen of Hell. Sabrina's destiny took a dark shift as soon as she made a deal with the Dark Lord. Although all the witches in the series have signed this book, the Dark Lord specifically needed Sabrina to sign it. Her destiny is far more different than the other witches in the show. Have you guys watched the show? Let me know in the comments below. Honestly, I did, but after season 2, I couldn't anymore. Let me know your thoughts though. Moving on at number 3, we have Lilith. Now, the description of Lilith varies depending on your beliefs. In Jewish folklore, Lilith is a female demon. In Luciferian witchcraft and Luciferianism, Lilith is described as the consort of Samael. Other people believe that she is the wife of Satan, or that Lilith was the first wife of Adam. But she wasn't that obedient to him, and Adam didn't like that, so Lilith left. Then God made Eve, who was more obedient. Lilith became jealous and turned into the snake that made Eve take a bite from the apple. The two were banished from the Garden of Eden, and Lilith turned into a demon. Her main goal, to get revenge on all men. Then you have the people that believe Lilith is a child-killing witch. She wasn't able to conceive, so she was jealous of pregnant women and would go around killing them or stealing their babies. In this case, we are looking at the version in which Lilith is a witch, obviously. In this case, Lilith is working alongside Satan to do his dark bidding for him. Their deal is that if she's with him, then she will work for him. But she's not always obedient. In fact, she has gotten frisky with other men. In the TV series Supernatural, Lilith is depicted as a white-eyed, powerful demon. She is said to be the first human that made a deal with Satan and promised to serve him. As a result, she became the first demon. In The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, we end up finding out that one of the characters, Miss Wardwell, is actually Lilith. She is referred to as Satan's concubine and the mother of demons, and of course, she's a witch. In fact, she is said to be the first witch in existence. She made a deal with Satan, or the Dark Lord. According to her story, she was wandering the wasteland aimlessly when she encountered Lucifer, the fallen angel. She made a deal to heal the wounds caused by the loss of his wings, if he in return helped her. She then pledged allegiance to him and became his handmaiden. In the end, Lilith wants to become his queen, which is why she goes to the extreme lengths to do whatever he tells her to do. Moving on to number 2, we have Sarah Good. Now, if you have seen the Fear Street trilogy on Netflix, then chances are you might be a little familiar with this story. The movie was loosely based off of the real witch, Sarah Good, but in the movie they changed her name to Sarah Fear. So Sarah was one of the first 3 women that were accused of witchcraft. It was her, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. These 2 other ladies were said to be real witches, and when they were accused, they brought forth Sarah Good's name, saying that she was a witch too. Little tattletalers. The townspeople were quick to believe this because Sarah never attended church. She lacked self-discipline and self-control, and she was 38, but apparently she looked like she was 70. That combined with the other ladies' testimonies had everyone against her. In fact, apparently when she was brought in front of the court, a number of witnesses began to twitch and rock back and forth and moan. So they were all like, damn, she's definitely a witch. Look at what she's doing to the people that accused her of being one. Not only that, but her own husband and daughter even admitted to Sarah being a witch as well. And then things kept getting worse and worse for her. At one point in her trial, one of the accusers started acting out and claimed that Sarah attacked her with a knife. In the end, of course, she was found guilty of witchcraft and was sentenced to death. But just before her death, she made a deal with the devil to curse a priest. She said, and I quote, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Now when she died, apparently the priest and his land both became cursed, just like Sarah claimed it would. To this day, it's said that Sarah continues to haunt the town, searching for those that have wronged her. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the Bowness witches. In 1679 in Bowness, Scotland, a number of women were accused of being witches. These women were Annabelle Thompson, Margaret Pringle, Margaret Hamilton, Bessie Yicker, and another woman named Margaret Hamilton. Now during this time, the hype and fear of witches was dying down. So people were shocked that out of nowhere 5 women were being accused. But rumor has it these women had renounced their baptisms and had been in contact with the devil on a number of occasions. They apparently had eaten, drank, danced, and had intercourse with the devil. Annabelle Thompson even admitted that she had made a deal with the devil for a better life. She had been widowed twice, and so she turned to the devil for help, and in return she would be loyal to him. She then invited the other women to come over and do all these things with the devil with her. The women then apparently formed a demonic pact with each other and Satan. One of the Margaret Hamiltons also admitted that she had met the devil. She claimed that the devil came to her in the form of a black dog. And she said that she was his servant for 3 decades already. And another was accused of using her witch magic to help get wealth. As a result, all the witches were found guilty and were strangled at the stake before being burned to ashes.
Number 5. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is one of America's most infamous criminal cases. He's practically single-handedly responsible for traumatizing an entire generation into a fear of clowns. A vicious sadist and a remorseless criminal, hearing clips of him talk is deeply disturbing. In a series of interviews in 1992, Mr. Gacy offered a rare window into the mind of a lunatic. In the interviews, Gacy is adamant that he is innocent of his crimes, and talks in a remarkably pleasant, almost affable way. He seems like an average Joe, a chatty old man that you would probably talk to at a park or something, until little cracks in the facade keep appearing and its darkness comes out. He appears to be talking himself in circles. At one point, it seems like he indirectly confesses to something he claimed that he hadn't, and when the interviewer presses him on it, he retracts like a child being caught in a lie, saying, "I'm sorry if I led you to believe that." In the same interview, the reporter asks Gacy to show him the rope trick, the horrifying method of strangulation Gacy would use on his victims by applying a tourniquet. Gacy obliges, but when the reporter hands him the string, he chuckles wryly and says, "Aren't you scared sitting next to me?" Most chilling is when the subject changes to talk of his clowning. He seems like he genuinely loved it, and knowing the unspeakable acts he committed as a clown makes it all the more sinister. He talks about how to him, clowning was an act of regression. It allowed him to explore his inner child within. Deeply, deeply unsettling. Perhaps most upsetting, though, is hearing Gacy talk about his anger towards his victim's family, saying they're overreacting. And you realize everything about the persona you've seen in the interviews is all just an act, just more makeup. My ghouls and goblins, if you're enjoying what we do on the channel and you want to hear more true crime stories, then subscribe to Top 5 Scary. We've got stuff coming every day. Number 4. The Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez terrorized Los Angeles for 14 months between 1984 and 1985. But perhaps you know him better under the sobriquet The Night Stalker. Maybe you saw the Netflix documentary that came out a bit recently. He was named that due to his propensity to seek into people's houses undetected and then carry out his sickening crimes. Eventually, he was caught after a facial sketch made newspaper front pages, leading to him being apprehended by an angry mob and arrested. He didn't see many interviews or too much direct media attention. attention, but one that was filmed prior to his final sentencing showcases his twisted nature and the utter remorselessness of someone who was called the Night Stalker. While being asked about the nature of his crimes and the horrific dealings of them, Ramirez appears amused, smiling, almost holding back laughter. When asked outright about his motives, he smirks as if he's holding in a secret. It gets worse when he starts to wax poetic and philosophize about human nature. He chuckles a bit when asked if he thinks of himself as evil and says, "We're all evil." He insists that what he did is no different than what governments do on a large scale. He claims, saying he is merely a product of his time and that he was living in bloodthirsty times. Every word hangs in the air uncomfortably. He denies to answer if he feels emotions. He says he gave up on the feeling of love and happiness long before his crime spree started. But everything he says seems very fake and self-serving. The interviewer even notes this, saying, "You do a very good job reading off the script, Richard." There's an appearance of gloating as he talks as well. He expresses that he felt he would be crushed by his own desires if he didn't act on them. And when asked if he's afraid, he says he doesn't care what happens to him, and he never did. Truly sombering. Number 3. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy has fascinated people for years, due in large part to how well he was able to disguise himself and make himself appear normal. But underneath his carefully put together persona was one of the darkest, most truly vile criminals the United States had ever seen. Unlike most serial offenders, Bundy not only kept up appearances, but was well groomed, charming, charismatic, and had a very compelling way with words, able to manipulate people scarily efficiently. He came from a happy family, a good Christian household, and didn't seem to fit the usual bill for these sort of criminals. The last interview ever conducted with him highlights a lot of these traits. He appears very soft-spoken, speaking quietly and almost soothingly to the camera, doing his best to garner sympathy from the audience and the interviewer. He attempts to blame a lot of his violence, darkness, and misdeeds on an addiction to lewd content. When he's describing it, he almost sounds like a man trying to talk about kicking caffeine, saying, "Oh, I think I'd be a lot better without it." Not just for him, but for lots of other people. When he says that phrase, he pauses a bit and gives a dark, knowing look to the interviewer. He's even joking around a bit, playfully. He comes across as very intelligent, answering all of the questions thoughtfully, but everything about it just seems terrifying, especially knowing the grisly nature of the things he did. But it feels like you're listening to a mask talk. It helps you understand how he was able to commit so much of what he did the way you hear him talk. When asked directly if he thinks he deserves his punishment, he answers eloquently, saying he's afraid to die, but he feels that he deserves to be punished to the most extreme extent of the law, and that society will be better off without dangers like him. It is a frigid look into the mind of someone so twisted. Number 2. Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is infamous. The name immediately evokes horrible emotions. Perhaps you've seen one of the many movies based on his twisted crimes, but the truth is always scarier. In 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer would give his last interview before his final sentencing, speaking to Stone Phillips, a former NBC anchor. The interview featured his father Lionel present, who Dahmer did not share a close relationship with. Now, the entire extended segment is harrowing. Dahmer is completely cold and calculating the entire time, speaking dryly with almost no emotion to anything he's saying. It's as fascinating as it is horrifying to hear him talk, to be honest. He remembers everything very clearly, and he describes it plainly, matter-of-fact, extremely sterilely. But there is a hint of remorse, almost regret over what he's done, but it is impossible to tell truly if it's genuine sincerity or if it's all just a carefully manipulated act to appear sympathetic. Perhaps the most disturbing insight into Dahmer's brain is when he tells the reporter that he found the violent acts of his crimes distasteful, and said that it was all just a means to an end of his ultimate goal, which was having complete physical domination over someone else. He describes his crimes as not something I enjoyed doing, and then proceeds to explain his sinister desire to create living zombies by putting acid in brains, leaving people docile and helpless. Dahmer was known as well to keep trophies of his victims, calling into question if any of these statements rang true. He reiterates that he just wanted someone to keep under his complete control, a slave to his will. And number 1. Charles Manson. Charles Manson may very well be the most notoriously well-known criminal in American history. He's definitely the most well-known cult leader. The cult leader led a string of violent attacks in 1969 to 1971 that would eventually culminate in his arrest and standing trial for his grievous crimes. Manson would spend the rest of his life in jail and occasionally entertained interviewers looking to shed light on the bizarre, grisly story. Manson was charismatic in his own way, persuasive, outrageous, and most importantly commanding and controlling. But if you ever saw any of his interviews after his arrest, you'd be forgiven for not thinking that, since pretty much every time he opens his mouth, it's either to share his bleak, nihilistic worldview, or raving in a way that is just completely incomprehensible and is the gibbering of a madman. As soon as this one interview starts, he boasts that he doesn't feel guilty since he hasn't done anything he's ashamed of, and then pausing for a second and clarifying, "I'm ashamed of not doing enough." From there, he then starts speaking complete gibberish, and then elaborating a bit on some of the conditions that made him this way. He talks about growing up without parents, which left him feeling like he was in a different dimension, saying that it's hard for him to think about things clearly, saying he hardly remembers breakfast. Watching Manson talk is a fascinating study. He almost seems fictional, a larger-than-life personality ripped out of a comic book film in it, but he's real. And the real darkness behind his eyes is a harrowing reminder of what can lie inside someone. Most of the interviews with Manson are like this. Ravings, rantings, a stream of vile hatred and aggression, and a peek into the minds of one of the most twisted men to ever live.
Kicking off our list today, we have Garreth Arenburg-Duchesne, one of the first women executed for sorcery in Denmark and in Scandinavia. In 1543, King Christian III of Denmark equipped a fleet of 40 ships to chase away an imperial Dutch fleet from the coast of Norway to the Netherlands. Outside of Helsinki, his fleet was stuck in a calm, and the whole project failed. Soon, a merchant's wife named Garreth Arenburg-Duchesne was arrested and tortured, believed to have gathered a group of witches in a valley outside the city and enchanted the ships. She eventually admitted to conducting a spell with a coven on a hill above Elsinore, and named several more people that were involved, male and female, including vicars, which led to the expansion of the witch trial. Her trial was handled by the royal governor Eske Bild. She also said that the enchantments would never disappear unless Garreth herself was allowed to remove them personally. The people that she named were arrested and tortured to an extent quoted as so hard their limbs were separated, but none other than Garreth confessed. In November of 1543, the king demanded for the rightful old principle of witches to be burned, but she sadly suffered through further interrogations first before meeting the end of her time. In fourth place, we have Agnes Sampson. Starting off this tale, when King James decided to marry Anne, Princess of Denmark, as quickly as he possibly could, this wedding was arranged in Denmark with a proxy standing in for him since he was, located in Scotland. Anne's attempts to join her new husband across the ocean were severely delayed by dangerous and life-threatening storms, so he eventually decided to join her instead. After another wedding ceremony, which the king actually attended, the couple decided to head home to Scotland, with yet another storm plaguing their journey. Witchcraft trials had already begun in Denmark. Remember Guide? I mentioned a minute ago? And the king had taken note. So when it was reported to him that witches East Lothian conspired to cause the treacherous weather that threatened not just his life, but that of his way too young bride, he believed what he was told. Agnes Sampson was an elderly woman who was known locally as a healer and a midwife, having cared for and successfully cured many neighbors of ailments throughout her life. She was a widow with several children, living close to poverty in East Lothian. She had been suspected and investigated for witchcraft before, so there was no surprise locally that her name was given. After she was named, Agnes was quickly captured and protested her innocence. The News from Scotland, which was an English-written pamphlet that would have been written in London around 1591, says that Agnes was shaved from head to toe and each part of her body tortured for hours, intentionally to cause intense pain. The devil's mark was found, and she confessed, saying that she and hundreds of other witches attended North Berwick Kirk on Halloween night to meet with the devil to end the life of the king. She claimed the devil appeared to her as a black man, a dog, or a hayrick. Agnes also mentioned various attempts to obtain the king's shirt or other personal linens in order to work her charms. She had attended a witches' convent at North Berwick with her son-in-law, where they collected bones and powdered them for Sid charms. To prove her magical powers, he told the king the exact words that had passed between him and his new wife on their wedding night. Agnes's trial was presided over by a judge, with a jury of 17 men from East Lothian, many of whom would have known Agnes personally. After hearing the evidence, they found her guilty of 49 out of the 51 charges. In January of 1591, she was taken to Edinburgh Castle and met her end by way of a rope necklace, with her body then being burned at the stake. The naked ghost of a bald Agnes is said to roam the palace of Holyrood House, the official Scottish residence of the British monarchy. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been or if you've seen Agnes yourself. In the middle of this scary sandwich, we have Angèle de la Barthe in third place. Born around 1230 in Toulouse, France, she was a noblewoman and a Gnostic Christian, which was a sect that was considered heretical by the Catholic Catholic Church. By definition, Gnostic Christian is a term that refers to various branches of early Christianity that claim to have special divine knowledge. They have different views of the Bible, Jesus Christ, salvation, and God compared to traditional Catholics. They have diverse teachings and practices such as Valentinianism, Sethianism, Manichaeism, and Mandaism. Some of them regard Jesus as a human being who became enlightened or Christed, while others see him as a divine being who came to lead humanity back to the light. In 1275, Angèle was accused of having sexual relations with Satan, and she was impregnated by him, giving birth to a baby that had the head of a wolf and a serpent's tail. This being consumed human flesh, and Angèle stole infants to feed it. When she was arrested, she was tortured and eventually confessed that the accusations were true. She was sentenced to death and burned alive, making her the first in Europe to have her life ended from accusations of witchcraft. Also, fun fact for you. At the time, it wasn't illegal to have sexual relations with demons. If you have access to a time machine out there, don't get any ideas. In second place, Walpurga Hosmanen was a midwife, born sometime between 1510 to 1527, where she lived and worked in Bavaria. Her trial was one of the most ruthless witch trials in Germany. Walpurga's life had been unremarkable until her arrest on charges of witchcraft, sorcery, and vampirism in the year 1587. After her arrest, she was subjected to terrible torture. Go figure, until she confessed to her deeds. According to her confession, soon after she became widowed in 1556, when she was working in the field of the city, she had made arrangements to meet a male co-worker for sex in her cottage later that evening. But he had not arrived. Instead, a demon had come dressed in his clothes. She established a relationship with said demon, named Federlin, who made her swear allegiance to the devil and promised to rid her of poverty. Hey, sounds pretty tempting. During her confession, she stated that she had sworn herself to Satan and written it on a contract, and Federlin had then taken her to the real devil and confirmed her contract, after which they had drunk wine, consumed the roasted flesh of young humans, and had sex. And in case I need to clarify, she had intercourse with Federlin, not the devil. Plot twist, I know. She described visiting the devil often, and her demon lover had also visited her plenty to have sex with her, even in the streets at night and while she was in prison, leaving every time she said the name of Jesus. Alright, well, that's one way to come down from it. Federlin had gifted her the magical ointment she used to harm her victims, which included humans of a variety of ages, animals, and even crops. She confessed to having ended the life of many young during her work as a midwife by applying the special salve or putting pressure to their foreheads and to have sucked their blood like a vampire. Walpurga also confessed to having eaten the young with other witches and using their hair for sorcery. The full list of crimes she confessed to was very long, with her victims including 41 young humans, 2 mothers in labor, and a multitude of other people and animals, including cows, pigs, geese, and a horse. The decision of authorities was swift and unanimous, with the church and royal court finding her guilty and sentencing her to death. Before being burned, she was first taken through the city and stopped 5 times before reaching the place of execution. At the first stop, they branded her left breast and right arm with irons, then her right breast at the second stop, her left arm at the third, with her left hand being then branded at the 4th stop. Once they reached the place of execution, her right hand, with which she had made her oath as a midwife, was cut off before finally being burned alive at the stake. Her ashes were not allowed to remain on soil, but were then dumped in a stream. In first place, we have Gilles Garnier. I swear I don't intentionally plan to name male witches as the worst on my list, but they tend to commit the most heinous acts throughout history. And before anyone wants to try to correct me in the comments again, men have often been named as witches throughout time. Continuing on, Gilles Garnier was a reclusive loner living in the woods around Dole, France. Despite being a solitary man, he got married in 1572. Historians have reported that Gilles was ill-equipped to provide for his family because he wasn't a very good hunter, being used to only having to provide for himself until that point. That's when he started hunting something else. Hey, anyone out there want to guess? Come on, I bet you can. Alright, I'll give it to you. Human flesh. The first hunt happened around September 29th of 1572 when Garnier killed a young woman, allegedly well in the form of a wolf, and brought some of the flesh home for his wife to eat. How, thoughtful? Throughout the autumn, more young humans were found unalived and mutilated, including another young woman that Giles bit and clawed at, but was interrupted by passerbys before fleeing. The girl sadly succumbed to her injuries a few days later. In November, Gilles ended the life of a young man this time, enjoying the flesh from his thighs and belly before tearing off a leg to save for later. I could name more, but I'm feeling a little queasy as it is. This caused a stir amongst the townspeople, who believed it was a werewolf who was committing the horrors. Many folks had witnessed a humanoid-looking wolf near the scenes of the crimes, with the animal darting off once it was aware of being seen. Then in January of 1573, there was one last death. This time, villagers heard a child screaming and the sounds of a wolf, witnessing the wolf attempt to flee the scene, but changing into the form of Gilles as it did. He was then arrested, put on the rack, and confessed to killing the young and consuming their flesh. At his trial, more than 50 people testified, and he was found guilty of lycanthropy, the ability to turn into an animal, and witchcraft. He and his wife were burned at the stake on January 8, 1573.
Starting off this countdown, we have the West Branch Witch. This witch is pretty famous in Ohio. So legend goes that there's this witch that many people have encountered in West Branch State Park. This witch tends to dress head to toe in all black. The first appearance was reported in 1960 by a man named B.A. Evans. He recently purchased a piece of land and later discovered a small cemetery on it. The cemetery contained 7 gravestones surrounded by a 40-inch wall. The gravestones are apparently from a family named the Elliots. Now, the headstone that gets the most attention is that of Clemenza. Clemenza was apparently killed by a group of townspeople after being accused of being a witch. As a result, she was pressed to death. A wooden board was placed on her, and then on top it was piled with stones until, her body was crushed by the weight. To this day, her grave is marked by a pile of stones that rests on top of it. Now it's said that she haunts the graveyard and the surrounding area. In fact, on her graveyard is a curse that says, and I quote, "Remember youth as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so must you be. Prepare for death and follow me." Now, if you read it out loud by her grave, she will apparently chase you away. Apparently, this whole legend is real though, and there is a curse upon her grave. One night, a group of hooligans took stones from her grave, which, hello, you're not supposed to do. Well, on the car ride home, they got into a deadly car accident and everyone in the car died except for one boy. That was the one boy who didn't take a stone from her grave. Had he done so, he wouldn't be here today. So, that is absolutely horrifying. No thanks. Moving on at number 4, we have Moll Dyer. Legend goes that Moll Dyer was a witch that lived in Maryland in the 17th century. But there are no historical records of her existence, so it might have just been a legend passed down from generation to generation. Either way, it's quite creepy. So the story takes place during a brutal winter in 1697. During this winter, there wasn't a lot of food available. In fact, many residents sadly passed away from starvation. Then there was Moll Dyer. She lived basically isolated from the community. Some say she wanted it that way since she was on the run after killing her husband. Well, one cold winter night, a group of vigilantes were like, let's just take her down. So they burnt her house down and chased her around with pitchforks, calling her a witch. Moll did manage to escape, but kept running until she fell upon a large boulder. She ultimately froze to death on that boulder. Several days later, a young boy found her corpse. Her body was frozen with one of her hands on the boulder, the other outstretched up towards the sky. Some say she froze to death, putting a curse on her tormentors and the town. What's scary is that the rock that she died on is still on display in this town. In fact, her handprint is imprinted onto the rock for eternity. And Moll Dyer's curse is still effective to this day. All men responsible for her death and their ancestors will suffer for the rest of their lives. They will be cursed with bad luck. In fact, it's said that her tormentors got sick and some passed away. Others had their land become barren and their livestock died. All from the curse that Moll Dyer put on them. In our third spot today, we have the Aswang. A subscriber actually brought this next witch to my attention, so I thought I would include it in today's video, and hopefully I pronounced the name right, okay? So this witch is a shape-shifting evil spirit. It's not just a witch though. It can also transform itself into a vampire, a werebeast, and a ghoul. But unlike normal vampires, this creature can go out during the day and they aren't harmed by the sunlight, and they don't also sparkle. During the day though, they are often seen with bloodshot eyes because they just spent the entire night searching for houses that are holding wakes so that they can then go in and then steal the bodies and then eat them. No need to worry though, they don't attack during the day, that's when they're at their weakest. Plus, they only attack in the darkness because that's when they believe that God is asleep. But when they do hunt, they go after the young and feast on their hearts and livers. In fact, they have this thing that comes out of their mouth and then can reach into a mother's womb to suck the baby out of them while the mother is asleep. Isn't that horrifying? It is. But wait, it gets worse. Apparently humans can choose to turn into this creature if they so desire. To do this, they have to tie a fertilized chicken egg to their stomach. The The chick will then pass through their flesh, and once this happens, they have to bury the shell in a bamboo tube with coconut oil and chicken poop. After that is all complete, they will gain the powers of this monster. And it sounds like I just made that all up, but I swear that's part of the legend. What's horrifying is that this witch moves quickly and silently. They are super tiny so that they can hide behind things with ease, so you'll never be able to hear or see them coming. Now, these witches are said to be extremely wicked. If you ever cross one, they'll make sure you will pay. They'll put a curse on you so that bones or insects will come out of your bodily orifices. Like, imagine just sitting there and then all of a sudden a spider crawls out of your eye, or you start coughing up bones. Yeah, no thank you. That's why these witches are so highly feared. Coming in at number 2, we have the Bell Witch. This is one of the creepiest stories out there because it involves a real life witch and a real life curse. So it all started back in the early 1800s with a man named John Bell. Now, John lived in a Tennessee farmhouse with his family. All was going well until one day he saw this weird creature. He described it as a dog-like creature, but with a rabbit's head. He tried to shoot at it, but nothing happened. Then John's daughter Betsy started to witness freaky things as well. In fact, on a number of occasions she was attacked by an unseen force, as she described it. Then other weird spooky things would happen, like they would hear chains being dragged through the house, or gulping and choking sounds and scratching at their bedposts. Finally, after months of tormenting, the entity finally spoke to them. Turns out that they were being haunted by their former neighbor, Kate Batts, who was actually a witch. She was dead set on destroying the family, especially John. She wanted to kill him. She never said why though, and I want to know why. Over the next 3 years, Kate tormented the entire family daily. She cast a number of spells on John from her grave. As time went on, John actually became weaker and weaker, until 1829 when he was found dead with a small vial of liquid near him. Apparently Kate, the Bell Witch, gave John this poison and he took his life. After his death, Kate stopped tormenting the family. So again, I want to know, what did John do to Kate to make her come for him? Like, seriously, I'd never want to get on her bad side. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the Chatapee. The Chatapee is this creepy witch/vampire creature from India. Legend goes that this creature is formed after a woman passes away during childbirth, or after a woman takes their own life. You know the succubus demon? The demon that presents itself to men during sleep and tries to have their way with them and then can kill them? Well, this is the Indian equivalent to the succubus demon. This witch rides on a tiger during the night. She then sneaks into your home without disturbing anyone and attacks men in their sleep. She will then suck the life out of them through their toes. Yeah, you heard me, their toes. I don't know why she wants those hairy stinky things near her face. Don't ask me. Anyways, some versions of this legend say that she has the power to change her form. She can transform into a tiger with all tiger features except one human leg. She also has hypnotic powers. She can cast a spell on the entire household so that everyone is in a trance-like state and won't wake up upon her entering. That's how she can come and go with ease. Now, this witch is so powerful that she can come after the strongest of men. And just like the succubus demon, she won't kill the man in one night. So she will revisit the house over and over again, slowly draining the life out of the man. She draws out his death, with the men falling weaker and weaker and not knowing what's causing it. Eventually he will grow so sick and pass away, and no one will know that this witch was to blame. Starting off this countdown, we have the Wabanaki Ghost Witch. This is a terrifying witch that scared Native American tribes for centuries. According to their legend, this witch was one who practiced evil magic when they were alive, and when they died, they came back to life as an undead monster. Its name is Scuddigamooch, and it craves human flesh and blood. The worst part, if it's coming for you, there's no stopping it. It will kill and devour any and everything that gets in its way. Now, during the day, this witch appears as an inactive human corpse, but as soon as night falls, the corpse comes to life and goes off searching for prey. In fact, it moves fairly quickly. It can transform itself into a ball of light and wisp around fast looking for someone to snack on. Once it finds its victim, it attacks from above. so you literally can't even see it coming. The legend also tells the story of one time this witch attacking a whole group of hunters and warriors. They were out spending the night in the forest when they were all attacked and killed one by this witch. I mean, it normally prefers to attack individuals who are on their own, but in this case, it must have been fairly hungry because it just devoured that whole group of men with ease. The only way to kill this witch is to burn her body right after she dies, or else she will come back to life and make your life a living hell. Coming in at number 4, we have Grýla. In Iceland, during the Christmas holidays, children have to watch themselves if they've been naughty that year. They don't find lumps of coal in their stocking. No, they run the risk of getting eaten by a nasty witch named Grýla. Grýla is depicted as a troll-like witch that lives in the mountains of Iceland. She has the ability to sense misbehaving children, and then she keeps note of all the kids who have wronged. Some depictions of her have her with hooves and 13 to 15 tails. Other depictions have her with nasty dirty nails, ears that droop to her chin, and eyes at the back of her head. Also, she's massive. You definitely don't want to get on her bad side. Did I mention that she likes stew? Stew, of course. That's where she puts the naughty children and then eats them right up. I should also mention that Grýla has been married 3 times. In total, she has 72 children. 72 children that she can send after you if you ever do her wrong. Some of these children are said to be murderers, others are said to be pranksters. With her most recent husband, she had 13 children who are called the Yule Men. They're kind of like the dwarves from Snow White, except they're evil. So the Yule Men are all gnome-like creatures that go around torturing households in their own way. They are named accordingly. For example, you have Spoon Licker that will go around licking all your spoons. Then when you go to use the spoon, you get a nasty taste in your mouth. Or you have Window Peeper. He likes to lurk outside your windows and then just watch you do stuff, you know? Sometimes he will even steal the stuff he sees. On the 13 days leading up to Christmas, these Yule lads will visit families one by one. Oh, you thought that was all? No, think again. Grýla also works alongside the Yule Cat. The Yule Cat is this monstrous beast that is said to tower above even the tallest houses. On Christmas Eve, she goes around eating So not only do you have to worry about Grýla, but you have to worry about her evil kids and her vicious cat that she can send after you as well. Moving on to number 3, we have Nailba. In 1990s, families in Bangalore were worried after hearing a story about a scary witch named Nailba. Story goes that one night a family was about to go to bed when they heard the sound of one of their family members' voice coming from outside. The father of the house opened the door about to welcome them in, but when he did, to his horrors, it was not his relative. Standing before him was an old woman, but before he could even say anything, this woman attacked him and instantly killed him. The next day, something similar happened to another family. It was late at night, they were about to go to bed when they heard a familiar voice outside. This time, the old woman attacked and killed the man with her nasty sharp nails. After a number of deaths in the village, everyone got spooked. They thought this was the works of a serial killer, but no, it was indeed something much worse. It was the work of this evil witch. And some believe the story to be true, and are fearful that they too will fall victim to her. In order to avoid encountering her, people would write Nailba on the door, which means come tomorrow. The witch would then see the sign and come again tomorrow to try and kill you. But as long as the words were still written on the door, you were safe for her. You know, like she'd come, oh, I'll come again tomorrow. Oh, okay, I'll come again tomorrow. You know, just, you get it. If not, she will try to trick you into opening your door for her, and then bam, you're dead. In our second spot today, we have La Lechuza. This is a popular witch in Mexican folklore. Legend goes that Lechuza was a woman that was caught practicing dark magic. The townsfolk were horrified and as a result had her killed. But Lechuza never fully died. She came back, taking form as a creepy bird lady, and promised she would seek revenge on the town. Now, she is a shapeshifter. She has the ability to look like a normal woman during the day, and then as a huge bird with a human's face during the night. I mean, her name literally means owl in English. So she's just this terrifying owl lady that likes to kill innocent people. In some stories, she is described as being 7 foot tall with a wingspan of 15 feet. She flies through the night hunting her prey. She often will perch on a tree branch and just watch from above. If you hear a bird screech at night, this is a bad omen. It's a sign that Lechuza is out looking for her next victim, and it could be you. Also, this witch can pretend to be a baby to trick her victims. She can disguise her voice and cry outside your door, so you're like, oh no, someone left a baby on my doorstep, and then you go outside and it's not Harry Potter left by Dumbledore. No, it's Lechuza, who will swoop down and carry you away with her sharp talons. She has the strength to carry a full grown man, so no one is safe. She's also known to attack from windows. You might be trying to sleep when all of a sudden you hear this annoying whistling or screeching noise coming from outside your window. You get so annoyed you whip the window open and bam, she'll attack you and scratch your eyes out. She's also known to run people off the road, so she's definitely someone you don't want to take on. And in our #1 spot today we have Black Annis. Black Annis is a tall, nasty witch from English folklore. She is depicted as having a blue face with glowing eyes, long sharp teeth, and claw-like fingers, which she uses to rip the skin off of her victims. So this witch is said to haunt the countryside of Leicestershire. She waits in the woods there until she finds herself the perfect victim. She will then pounce on them, rip them open, and feast on them. She likes to drain them completely of blood by sucking it out of them, and then feasts on their insides. To make matters worse, she will keep the deceased with her, and once their skin is completely dried out, she will use the skin and sew it together to make clothes for herself. Like what the actual hell? It's giving me Buffalo Bill vibes for sure. Due to this legend, kids were told never to go into Dane Hills alone, for that's where she supposedly lives. Not only that, if you're out in the woods and hear a high-pitched howl, you know that she's close. Furthermore, if you listen carefully, sometimes you'll be able to hear her sharp teeth grinding together as she waits for her prey.
In 5th place, we have witch cakes to kick us off. Sadly, these aren't yummy Halloween cakes, a thought which makes me very hungry, but instead a bizarre form of counter magic, a supernatural dessert used to identify suspected evildoers. In cases of mysterious illness or possession, witch hunters would take a sample of the victim's urine, mix it with rye meal and ashes, and bake it into a cake. This stomach-turning concoction was then fed to a familiar or animal helper of the suspected witch in the hopes that the creature would fall under its spell and reveal the name of the guilty sorcerer. During the hysteria that preceded the Salem witch trials, Tituba famously helped prepare a witch cake to identify the person responsible for bewitching young Betty Paris and others. The brew failed to work, and Tituba's knowledge of spells and folk remedies was later used as evidence against her when she was accused of being a witch. Before I forget, another use for a witch cake came from burning the pastry in hopes that the scorching heat would transfer to the witch and force her to reveal herself. Whew. Anybody else starting to get warm? Oh great, just me. In 4th place, we have a scold's bridle, also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brank's bridle, or simply branks. This was an instrument of punishment as a form of public humiliation. This thing was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. My brain just jumped to a similar modern device used for pleasure instead of pain, and no, I will not elaborate on that thought, but let's clarify. A bridle bit, or cur plate, around 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters in size, was slid into the mouth and pressed down on top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely, and caused extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. This prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing as I've always been a chatty Cathy, I can totally see how I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts just thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to, draw in crowds. First recorded in Scotland in 1567, the branks were also used in England and its colonies. The Kirk sessions in barony courts in Scotland inflicted the contraption mostly on female transgressors, and women considered to be rude, nags, common scolds, drunken, but mostly witches. It was also used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates. The person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation and sometimes beaten. Just sometimes, not every time apparently. Knowing what I know about history and cover-ups, I'm going to lean towards probably most of the time. The Lanarkberg records record a typical example of the punishment being used. When wearing the device, it was, impossible for the person to either eat or speak. Other pranks included an adjustable gag with a sharp edge, causing any movement of the mouth to result in laceration of the tongue. In Scotland, pranks could also be permanently displayed in public by attaching them, for example, to the town cross, tron, or toll booth. Then the ritual humiliation would take place, with the miscreant on public display. Displaying the pranks in public was intended to remind the populace of the consequences of any rash action or slander. Whether the person was paraded or simply taken taken to the point of punishment, the process of humiliation and expected repentance was the same. Time spent in the brittle was normally allocated by the Kirk session in Scotland or by a local magistrate. In third place, we have a ducking chair, not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools women accused of having sexual acts with the devil would have to sit on. I sadly don't have enough information to unpack that stool, other than ouch! But let's get on with the ducking, shall we? The ducking stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them so that they would not fall out during their immersion. How thorough. The earliest record of the use of such is towards the beginning of the 17th century, with the term first being attested in English in 1597. It was used both in Europe and in the English colonies of North America. Usually the chair was fastened to a long wooden beam fixed as like a seesaw on the edge of a pond or river. And as much as I love and miss wooden playgrounds, I feel like this might not have been as fun. Sometimes the ducking stool was not a fixture, but was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels so that it could be wheeled through the streets, and at the river edge was hung by a chain from the end of a beam. In sentencing a woman, the magistrates ordered the number of duckings she should have, and as much as I've scoured the internet, I can't seem to find number data on this. If you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. Another type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and was a chair on two wheels with two long shafts fixed to the axles. This was pushed into the pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes the punishment proved fatal and the subject died. Once again, the sometimes should be taken with a pound of salt. In medieval times until the early 18th century, ducking was a way used to establish whether a suspect was a witch. The ducking stools were first used for this purpose, but ducking was later inflicted without the chair. In this instance, the subject's right thumb was bound to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe, a rope was tied around the waist of the accused, and she was thrown into a river or a deep pond. If she floated, it was deemed that she was in league with the devil, rejecting the baptismal water. If she sank, she was cleared. Oh, and she'd be dead. Can't forget that part. Silly me. In second place, we have witch mark hunting and pricking. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. This devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. Prosecutors might also search for the witch's teat, which was an extra nipple allegedly used to suckle the witch's helper animals. In both cases, it was really easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Oh my, the horror. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. I'm trying to think of just how many birthmarks I have all over my body, so just add that to the tally of how I'm, a witch. Seriously, I feel the burning from the flames already. In the midst of witch hunts, desperate villagers would sometimes even burn or cut off any offending marks on their bodies, only to have their wounds labeled as proof of a covenant with the devil. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I'm adding like scars to my blemish count, yeah, forget it. Okay, I think the temperature in here just went up another couple of degrees. Seriously. If witch hunters struggle to find obvious evidence of witches' marks on a suspect's body, they might resort to the ghastly practice of pricking as a means of, sussing it out. Come on! Even having a flawless body isn't going to exonerate you? What the heck? Witch hunting books and instructional pamphlets noted that the marks were insensitive to pain and couldn't bleed, so examiners used specially designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused person's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced the desired results. In England and Scotland, the punishment was eventually performed by well-paid professional prickers, many of whom were actually con men who used dull needle points to identify fake witches' marks. Well then, if you ever feel like your job just, isn't real, remember that people in history were paid to do well. Along with pricking, the unfortunate suspect might also be subjected to scratching by their supposed victims. This test was based on the notion that possessed people found relief by scratching the person responsible with their fingernails until they drew fluid. If their symptoms improved after clawing at the accused's skin, it was seen as partial evidence of guilt. No, absolutely not. I can't see anyone being proven innocent whatsoever from this nonsense. Talk about a biased court. In first place, we have dismemberment and mutilation. This is where my own stomach gets all topsy-turvy, so fair warning, I can handle creepy stuff, no problem. But gore? There's a reason I haven't been able to bring myself to watch the Terrifier movies. So when witch hunters wanted to get answers back in the day, if I haven't made it clear enough by now, they didn't really care about being humane or, coercion, just being right. They would do whatever they deemed necessary to get a confession, leading many witches to confess just to make the pain stop and end their lives, humanely, say goodbye to your fingernails, because that was practically just a footnote in what they were allowed to do. While Perga Hosmanen of Bavaria was led through multiple different stages of mutilation while being paraded to her execution. At the first stop, her left breast and right arm were branded with irons, then her right breast at the second stop, her left arm at the third, with her left hand being then branded at the fourth stop. Once they reached the place of execution, her right hand, with which she had made her oath as a midwife, was cut off before she was finally burned alive at the stake. Oh, her ashes were not allowed to remain on soil, but they were just, dumped in a stream. Probably the most extreme extent of this was a punishment normally reserved for killers, but exceptions were made for witches who confessed without torture to crimes deemed brutal enough for it. Are y'all ready for this? The offender would be strapped to 4 horses, with 1 arm or leg attached to each separate horse, and then on command, the horses would start running and rip the offender's arms and legs off. The person would die somehow, and painfully through life source and limb loss.